What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if GOJO was reborn as the strongest in Bleach? Part 2. If you enjoy this type of content, please capture the like button in your domain expansion. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the strongest. The following day, GOJO followed the usual group, though without Rukia this time since it wasn't a shared course, to the Kido training ground. The previous day, after getting their Zanpakuto, they had just been given basic training, such as swinging the sword again, and again almost mindlessly. GOJO had never been a sword master. After all, he never had the need to wield any weapons in the first place. But this didn't mean that he was a beginner either. After all, one of his students, because of the lack of cursed energy, had needed to become extremely proficient in cursed weapons wielding. How could he keep his head high as a teacher if he wasn't even able to give some help to his students? Still, despite all his arrogance, he never belittled the necessity to understand the basics, and that's why he didn't riot even though that task was super boring. Those guys should do like me and find better ways to entertain the students while they train. He snickered at the thought of the training regiment he had concocted for Yuji when he was still a newbie. "GOJO," Momo asked after hearing him. Sorry, I'm just thinking about how cute Rinji and Rukia were. Though I am a little disappointed in Rinji." On the side, he could see Rinji stiffen a little at this. "What do you mean?" GOJO turned toward him for a short while then shook his head. "I won't stick my nose in your love story, dude. You do as you like." Rinji clenched his fist before lowering his head. He knew what GOJO was alluding to. He had thought that he was able to hide his feelings quite well, but he must have been wrong if someone he just met 2 days ago could see it. The atmosphere cooled down a little, but GOJO did not particularly care. Rinji did indeed disappoint him a little. He had never been in love, but he understood how feelings such as love and friendship should be treasured more than anything else. After all, be it in his world or the afterlife, there was nothing easier than losing the people you cared for. This rule held even more so for people like them who were training to fight. Rather than wallowing in self-doubt and hesitations, you should take the hand of the person you love and never let go no matter what. Well, not like it matters to me. Renji wasn't his friend. For GOJO, he was just a funny dude that could help him pass time. Why would he waste his time by thinking about the personal problems of someone he had just met? Author's note: you should care about how to fix his damn eyebrows like TF. Kido training ground. The Kido training ground was more like a shooting ground than anything else. Facing the students was a stern black-haired woman seemingly in her early 20s. Her outfit was composed of a black kimono and a badge with the title vice captain on her shoulder, as well as a pair of glasses. The moment they saw her, the students began to cause a ruckus. "Hello everyone, I am Nanao Ayase, a special lecturer. Normally I only teach the 6th year students in my spare time. But today I decided to teach the first years." Her voice was calm and a little chilly as she adjusted her glasses. And if GOJO wasn't wrong, she had turned to look at him when she said the last line. The teacher who was supposed to teach them today advanced and said, "You guys should be happy to receive this privilege. Miss Ayase is the vice captain of the 8th division, as well as a Kido expert. 50 years ago, when she was a student, she had enough credit to enter the Kido Corps, and was specifically scouted by the captain of the 8th division, Shunsui Kairaku. Man, this guy is the ultimate definition of bootlicker. Well, I guess with credentials like this, she is really worthy of it," GOJO thought in amusement. Meanwhile, even though she kept a straight face, Nanao felt like her face was burning. She had always hated such excessive praise. After all, the reason she was so good at Kido was just that she had no other choice, since she was unable to bond with another Zanpakuto aside from their inherited one. As for being specially scouted, that damn old man was her own uncle, so she had nothing to feel proud of. Anyway, so this is my target. Looking at the blindfolded silver-haired man, she had to admit that even though she wasn't particularly interested in having any form of relationship with a man, he was quite handsome. The reason she had decided to teach the first years this time was because she had been quite curious about the man that had caused a small stir in the Siriidii before even entering it. More than anything, the part about how he had been able to learn Kido just by watching was something that made her really curious, though also a little jealous. Kido was a profound art, and few Shinigami, even at the captain level, could be said to reach the expert level, much less the level of master. As such, for someone like him to exist was something she had to verify for herself. Okay, everyone, some of you already have some understanding, but I will still begin with the basics. Wait for me to finish before asking any questions. Understood? Yes. Satisfied with the response, she began to explain. Kido is an intricate practice that requires a deep understanding in Ryu-ryoku and Ryatsu manipulation. Over the long history of Kido, we have managed to subdivide it into 3 great types: the way of destruction, Heido, the way of binding, Bakudo, and the way of healing, Kaido. Our Western branch simply calls them magic spells. But well, those guys still aren't properly established. A Western branch? Well, it's understandable. It would be weird for the afterlife to only belong to Asia. Gojo thought while listening to Nanao. Kaido aside, each Heido and Bakugo are numbered, and the higher the number, the more powerful it is. Of course, this wasn't all. There were also some Kido outside of those 3 that were known as Forbidden Kido. But no way she was going to talk about it to the students. After all, she liked having her head on her shoulders. Remembering how her mother had been executed because she broke some nonsensical law, her mood dampened. In order to use a Kido, 3 steps are necessary: visualizing the spell, chanting the spell, and naming the spell. Well, let me show a mid-grade Heido as an illustration. At this, she turned to face one of the targets standing about 100 meters away from her. Ye Lord, mask of blood and flesh, all creation, flutter of wings, ye who bears the name of man. Inferno and pandemonium, the sea barrier surges, march on to the south. Heido number 31 Shikaho. A red ball of fire formed in her hand before being launched like a laser beam. The effects had been limited, but it had completely obliterated the target. While the others were astonished at the power, Gojo on the other couldn't help but have his smile cramp a little when she chanted her spell out loud. Even though the effects were pretty incredible, the problem wasn't here. I will freeze in hell before I am heard chanting a spell like this. He seriously wondered if the ones who created those Kido spells didn't suffer from Chinibu syndrome. Nanao, who didn't know what Gojo was thinking, continued her lecture. Of course, you should understand that most enemies won't just stand there like this target and let you finish. You need to be fast on your feet and use different ways of incantation. But the easiest is without a doubt simply foregoing the incantation altogether. Though, the higher the level, the harder it is. Heido number 31 Shikaho. She once again launched the same spell, though it was clearly weaker, as you can see. The drawback of using a spell without the incantation is a loss of power. So, any questions? Momo raised her hand and asked. I searched for some Kaido spell in my spare time, but they were very hard to find. What's more, as you said, they weren't numbered. Why is it? Nanao nodded. I am unable to answer this question. To be honest, Kaido isn't even in your lesson, as only the 4th division can teach it. If you are interested in healing, you just need to reach a good enough level in Bakudo, and you will be accepted. Next, this time it was Gojo who asked. So, is it possible to not use a Kido without uttering a word? Nanao frowned. To be honest, those able to do so are rare. Those who use Kido are divided into 3 ranks: practitioners, experts, and masters. In the whole Siriidii, out of all the current captains, I only know 5 who are at the level of master, and only those at this level would be able to do what you asked. Oh, and is it possible to know who those 5 are? It isn't a problem. The first one and most powerful is the Captain Commandant. The second one is Captain Unohana of the 4th Division. The third one is Captain Jinrei Kachiki of the 6th Division. Then Captain Ishin Shiba of the 10th, and finally Captain Yukatake of the 13th. At the end of the lecture, as students left one another, student Satoru Gojo. Stay please. Nanao Ise called for Gojo to stop as he was walking with Hinamori and the gang. Stopping, he shrugged before saying, You guys continue. I will talk with the charming lady. Smiling, he waved his hand before sauntering toward Nanao. Hello. To what do I owe the pleasure? Nanao frowned a little at the way he talked while wondering why all the geniuses she knew had such weird personalities. "Good morning, Mr. Gojo. I called you because I was curious about something. Could you reproduce the spell I just used as a demonstration?" she said as she indicated towards the shooting range. She was really curious. Was he really able to do as was said? "Oh." Gojo tilted his head for a short while, before smiling as understanding dawned upon him. "I could. Of course I could. But why should I?" His earlier frivolous tone vanished as his demeanor became way more serious. Even though he was still smiling, Nanao instinctively knew that he wasn't playing around. This abrupt change was a little sudden, and she was taken aback as she asked, "Did I offend you?" He looked at her up and down before shaking his head, and answered again with a voice full of mirth, "Nah, sorry. Seems like I was just being a little too sensitive." He was not a circus monkey that would perform at the demand of the public. In all his life, he had seen so many people act like this around him that he was sick of this. But it seemed that it had been a misunderstanding. Deciding to lighten the atmosphere, he condensed a little ball of Riryoku above his finger. "So, let's go back to the previous topic. I do not mind showing off a little to a beautiful woman, but I need a little something." Nanao nodded. "What do you wish? Though I must just warn you that I do not have much money on me." "Oh, this isn't a problem at all. I don't want your money." "Then what?" Raising his blindfold, he showed a charming smile as he said, "What I want is, if you say something stupid like what I want is you, I am going to slap you." She said this in such a matter-of-fact way that Gojo's smile cramped. Slumping a little, he couldn't help but ask, "How did you see this coming?" Nanao sighed as she shook her head. How could she tell him that she regularly heard such stupid and corny jokes almost every day from her captain? What's more, she had long sworn off of any form of relationship. She didn't wish to be yet another woman who made her loved ones suffer because of the curse of the ISE clan. "So, what do you wish in exchange for showing your skills?" Releasing a sigh, Gojo completely took off his blindfold as he said, "You are really no fun. But it doesn't matter. I wasn't joking when I said that I wanted you. More precisely." Pointing at the target, he murmured, "Hado number 31 Shikaho." A fire beam, as powerful as the one launched by Nanao when she used the full incantation, was fired from his finger and thoroughly obliterated the target. Turning his back to the explosion, he gave his brightest smile as he said, "I want your skills, your knowledge, your know-how. Absolutely everything about you. What do you think?" Looking at the man standing in front of her, Nanao couldn't help but feel a chill. At the same time, she couldn't help but wonder, how far could he go? How powerful could he become? That's why, without even stopping to think, she answered, "I will teach you everything I know." She knew that her curiosity could cause her many problems down the road, but she couldn't let go of the opportunity to train a genius like him. Perhaps she could witness the birth of another master level in Kido. 2 weeks seemed like a short time, but in reality, so many things could happen in that time frame. The first thing of note was how the fame of Gojo was continuously growing in the academy. More precisely, he was becoming more and more infamous as a problem student. The cause for this? Aside from the first 3 days of class where he followed the introduction of all the basic arts dutifully, he immediately became a truant not long after. He discarded all classes aside from the homeroom and general knowledge class, and even during those classes, he would either be sleeping or reading a book while the lecture was going on. Today was supposed to be a class about Ho-Ho and Hakuda for the first year. Those 2 classes were generally held by the same professor, since the techniques were about using Riryoku to empower the body and fight. The lecturer, Kairo Fan, had always been proud of his place and the course he taught. After all, most Shinigami never awakened their Zanpakuto. Meanwhile, very few Shinigami were really interested or had the talent for Kido. But Hakuda and Ho-Ho? Those skills were basically the most fundamental skills necessary for survival on the battlefield. For him, those 2 skills were the noblest ones. That's why, as a member of the noble Fan family, he couldn't accept this student. "Satoru Gojo," he bellowed with clear anger in his voice. His gaze, directed on the student lying down on the grass, seemed to spit fire. Yawning, Satoru stretched for a little while before standing up. "Hello, Teach. What brings you to me on such a beautiful morning?" His nonchalant answer nearly made Kairo have a stroke. Taking a deep breath, he continued in a calmer tone, "Student Satoru Gojo, explain to me, why did you not come to class today?" Gojo lowered his black glasses as he stood up. Those glasses had been made for him after he explained his needs. Like his pair on Earth, they were nearly opaque for anyone but him. Looking at the prof, he sighed as he said, "You are a good professor, but your class ain't for me." GOJO was serious. Even though some of the noble students looked down on the commoners from the Rukongai, there was no outright bullying or conflict. It was easy to understand. The nobles had no control over the Godii 13, and it wasn't uncommon for people of the Rukongai to become seated officers. No smart noble would bother someone who could potentially become someone great. The same went for the professors. Even though many of them were nobles, they did not treat the students differently. The man in front of him was a dedicated teacher who, aside from an excessive pride in what he taught, didn't have any bad traits. GOJO understood that the man was acting in justified anger, but this did not change his opinion on the matter. "Teach, I will be honest with you. There's really nothing I can learn from you anymore." Shunpa was a very impressive art. It was so impressive that it was frightening. In his free time, meaning every time he ditched class, he had researched the feats of some of the present and past captains in the Soul Society, and all he could say was one word: badass. One of the greatest feats of speed he read was a technique derived from the Shunpa called speed clone. Realistically speaking, for a human to create a speed clone with basically no blur, they would have to move at about Mach 3 at minimum. In the information he obtained, it seemed that Soifan was able to produce more than 10 clones at the same time. He shuddered just at the thought of the speed necessary for such a feat if he had fought against her back then. Rakugan or not, she would have wiped the floor with him. Now though, well, at least I should have a chance to fight without being humiliated. He was thinking, so when from the corner of his eyes, he could see the teacher use Shunpa. Compared to the inexperienced mobs of the 2nd Division who he fought previously, he was clearly much faster. Still too slow. He easily avoided and moved behind the teacher while sending a hit. Blocking it with his arms, Cairo immediately grabbed GOJO's fist and sent another punch. Even though it was quite an awkward position, GOJO didn't try to avoid the punch, but rather countered with one of his own. Just as it was about to connect, a grin formed on his face. Black lightning gathered on his fist while the air itself seemed to explode from the release of power. Cairo's expression changed. He knew that if their punch connected in this situation, losing his arm would be the least of his worries. But just as it was about to happen, he received a low kick from GOJO and was propelled a few meters away from him. "Hee, seems like I won." Giving a V sign of victory, he grinned before walking away. "Wait, what is it, Teach? You want another bout?" Cairo didn't answer the taunt. His expression looked as if he had seen a ghost. "That Hakuda technique. Who taught you it?" He was extremely surprised at GOJO's skills in Shunpa. "But that last technique? No one taught me." "Impossible. You mean you created it yourself?" "Hee. In a way, you could say so. Copyright could go piss itself. It wasn't like the creator of Black Flash could come to complain, right? Well, Teach, I should have shown you that I really don't need to follow your class. So see ya. I have a date with a beautiful girl wearing glasses." Waving his hand, he began to walk away before stopping. "Also Teach, this isn't Hakuda, but Jujitsu." "Jujitsu?" Cairo murmured the weird name while sinking deep in thoughts. That technique he used, he couldn't be mistaken. It was eerily similar to another technique he knew the existence of. Shunko. It was the highest form of Hakuda, a technique that fused Hakuda and Kido and produced a powerful gust of winds covering the arms and back of the user. A technique created and developed by the current Captain Soifan. Author's note: Yoruichi wants to claim copyright. Even though there were some differences, the similarities were too great to ignore. I need to report it to Captain Soifan. GOJO, who did not know about the existence of Shunko, was humming quite happily. During those 2 weeks, thanks to Nanao's lessons, his knowledge of Kido had continued to grow steadily. What's more, she had taught him all the Heido and Bakudo from number 1 to number 60. Even though she had mastered up to number 70, she had refused to teach him those techniques, since only seated officers had the right to learn Heido above 60. Since GOJO didn't want to create problems for his benefactor, he didn't insist and began the process of creating jujitsu in the Soul Society. For this, and had been the ones he chose as an experiment, while Divergent Fist was just a crude release of cursed energy. Black Flash was a more intricate technique that required an extreme control of cursed energy. Black Flash was a technique that created spatial distortion when a user connects with an impact of cursed energy within 0.00001 seconds of a physical hit. The phenomenon causes cursed power to flash black. Because of this stringent requirement, even when he was alive, he was never able to maintain or use continuously black flash. At the same time, he had never really tried hard, since he simply did not need this technique when he was alive. Finally, that technique only brought a 2.5 increase in strength. For people like Yuji, who already had insane physical strength, Black Flash was like giving wings to a tiger. But for him, it had been useless, at least when he was alive. Feeling the tingles in his arms, he couldn't help but smirk. Ryuryoku is really superior to curse technique. The increase brought by his Black Flash was far above what he had expected. About 5. This was simply insane. The best. This isn't the limit. What made him really happy wasn't Black Flash itself, but the realization that any curse technique he used with Ryuryoku would be far stronger than the original version. If so, what would happen when I managed to recreate Limitless? He shivered in excitement just at the thought. Shino Academy Library. How many times did I tell you? Stop ditching class. Looking disapprovingly at Gojo, Nanao complained once again. She had enough on her plate when dealing with her own captain. But it seemed that without knowing, she had added another problem next to her, putting back the book he was holding before taking another one. Gojo simply gave a short laugh without even raising his head. Currently, he obviously didn't wear his glasses nor his blindfold. After all, no matter how powerful his eyes were, he wasn't absurd to the point that he could read with something covering them. Seeing him like this, Nanao gave up and turned toward Toshiro, who was sitting next to him. Please, no matter what happens, don't grow up like him. Toshiro could only nod awkwardly. Nanao had met all of Gojo's companions, and even though all of them were somewhat awkward around her because of her rank and temperament, they all understood that, deep down, Nanao was a kind and gentle woman, though she was somewhat strict. In fact, the closest to Nanao after Satoru wasn't Toshiro, but Momo. Generally, she would also be present in the library, but she was currently held back since she and Kira were the representative of Class 1's first years. Satoru and I-san, you should really calm down. I have overheard some of the students while coming here, and it seems like your fight with Kairo-sensei is already known to all the students and teachers. Your infamy is continuing to grow. And so, this time, the two of them were stumped. Feeling the silence around him, Gojo sighed. He knew that they were worried about him, though having people worry about him was really a foreign feeling. Look, what was my goal in entering the academy? Learning more about Kido and the basic knowledge from the academy. And what am I doing right now? See, means and objectives. People always get entangled in what they shouldn't. Currently, I have basically succeeded in my goal. So, this academy has nothing to teach me anymore. Gojo wasn't joking. His status as a student had never been something he attached importance to. All he wished for was to obtain information and knowledge. In fact, you could even say that the academy is more of a liability currently. After all, as a student, even though he had access to a large amount of information, he also had many restrictions on what he could learn. As such, he needed to upgrade his rank, which meant becoming a Shinigami. If it wasn't because of the outing that will happen in the real world in 2 weeks, I would have already applied to graduate. He already had some grasp of Zanjutsu, and even though he didn't awaken a Shirkai yet, having a Shirkai was never the goal of that class. Otherwise, 99% of the students would never pass. Sighing, Nanao decided to not insist. After all, she knew that Gojo wasn't a lazy man. He just had his priorities straight and discarded absolutely everything that wasn't necessary. What's more, she had to admit that the new technique he had created really intrigued her. After all, the women from the ISE family were unable to bond with an Asachi, and she wasn't an exception to the rule. Because of this, she seriously lacked means of attack. But if she could learn his Black Flash, well, it isn't that easy. It had taken 1 week since their meeting for Gojo to create Black Flash, but even he had some trouble controlling it. Well, I didn't call you today just to scold you. Seriously? Don't stop, please. I must admit that being looked at coldly while being scolded by a glasses-wearing beauty has a charm of its own. Toshiro suddenly shivered at Nanao's cold stare, but Gojo simply laughed. Perhaps stopping is better. Wouldn't want to awaken some weird fetishes. Right. Nanao could feel her headache growing. Gojo was really an attractive man, and she had to admit that he didn't let her be indifferent. Thankfully, each time she felt some feelings growing, he would destroy those budding feelings with his weird jokes. Could we talk seriously, please? Sorry, I will be serious. So what is the matter? After making sure that he wouldn't continue with the joke, she began seriously. Did you decide which division you will join? Nanao knew that Gojo's previous words were right. At his current level, he could graduate any time he wanted. In fact, with his talent in Kido and Hakuda, he could even enter any department he wished and could even be given a seat. This was how talented he was. Gojo took another book and said nonchalantly, "Well, I do have an idea in mind, but I am open to suggestions. Do you want me to enter your division? To be honest, no. My captain is already a pain. I wouldn't be able to take it if I had to add another one." Ouch! I feel my heart breaking at those hurtful words. Shiro, don't you think she is too mean? You will join the same division as me, right? Haha. All Toshiro could do was give an awkward laugh while averting his eyes. To think that even my little brother would discard me. Sigh, what a cruel world. Oh, the Ice Beauty smiled. You must be mistaken. No, I am sure I saw it. Nothing can go past my eyes. But seriously though, why the question? In about 10 years, the current captains of the 6th and 3rd Division will step down. This will create a vacuum in many divisions. Oh, you want me to gun for the captain position? Nanao hesitated a little before nodding. I know it's absurd, but I feel like if it's you, it shouldn't be hard. At worst, you could become vice captain or 3rd seat, though you can't become the captain of the 6th Division. There's nothing I cannot do. I am serious. Currently, there are 2 candidates for the position. Vice Captain Byakuya Kachiki was already chosen to replace Captain Jinrei Kachiki. He was already judged to have all the qualifications, so it's just about him waiting now. Ah, nepotism at its finest. Not really. Not even one of the 4 greatest noble houses can choose a captain. To become one, you need to fulfill some conditions, such as the first one, and the most common, is the demonstration of the Bankai. This needs to be done in front of at least 3 captains, including the commander. The second way is harder since you need to be recommended by 6 out of the 13 captains, and then get accepted by another 3 out of the 7 remaining. The final way is the hardest and simplest at the same time. You simply need to beat the captain under the witness of at least 200 members of his squad. Saying she frowned. Frankly, even if you become as strong as a captain, I don't advise you to choose this one. Aside from the 11th Division, where it's basically a tradition for the new captain to kill the old one. If you become a captain using such a way, you won't be able to make it run smoothly. She really couldn't understand those muscle heads of the 11th Division. The 11th was overall the strongest division. Each captain of such a division should have been a precious resource. But the current captain, Zaraki Kenpachi, was the 11th Kenpachi, meaning that 10 captains died before him. This was incredibly wasteful and stupid in her opinion, but she had neither the power nor the drive to protest against such a tradition. Anyways, you talked about 2 candidates, right? That Kachiki, whatever guy gunning for the 6th Division. So what about the 3rd? It's Byakuya. Byakuya Kachiki. Yeah, Byakuya. Who cares about that? So who is the second dude? Sai, the candidate for the position of captain in the 3rd Division, is the vice captain of the 5th Division. Jin Ikamaru, Suriidei, 2nd Division. Currently, Soi Fan was seated on the chair of the leader of the Fan family, and as such did not wear her captain cloak. The Fan family was a noble family affiliated to the Shohoin family. Normally, the current leader of the Shohoin family, Yashiro Shohoin, should have taken the position as captain of the 2nd Division. But, even though he was an incredibly talented young boy who would without a doubt reach his sister's level given enough time, as of now, he still didn't have the strength required to stand as a captain. Currently listening to the reports, Soi Fan was at first a little bored, but she immediately straightened when she heard about Gojo and his feat in the first place. Kairo Fan was no pushover, so for him to lose in a contest of speed and techniques showed just how much Gojo had grown in such a short time. But for him to create a technique that looked like Shunko, she believed that no subordinate of hers would provide fake information, so she did not doubt it. This made his worth in her eyes rise even more. Perhaps I should send him a special invitation? It was pretty common for special students to be allowed to participate in missions with some official Shinigamis. This was because having experience beforehand was always a good thing. What's more, the case of Jin Ikamaru had already left a precedent, so it wasn't a problem. It was just that she had already been refused once. She didn't have the face to be refused a second time. What should I do? Becoming a captain, huh? If he had to be honest, the position of captain didn't particularly attract him in any way. It was simply too much responsibility. Back then on Earth, the reasons he fought to become one of the higher-ups was to put a stop to the rampant corruption of those old bastards entrenched in their own way and usher a new wave by grooming talented individuals. With students such as Yuta and Yuji, two students with the potential to reach a level near his own, he could be said to have perfectly succeeded in his life goal. Currently though, thinking too much is useless. Gotta do what I gotta do. Closing the book in his hand, he stood up and belatedly realized that the sun was setting down. As such, after putting his glasses on, he placed the book back in its place and left. Nanao and Toshiro had long since left the library, and the library girl this time wasn't Hataru, so he simply decided to leave. As a vice captain, Nanao was extremely busy and could only spare some time to meet him from time to time and help him. He was really grateful for all the help she had given him. As for Toshiro, he had to go to the Zanjutsu class. As he had thought, Toshiro was really a genius, and his Asachi was already beginning to show individual traits. At this rate, it wouldn't take more than a few months for him to get the name of his Zanpakuto and reach the Shurkai, a level that nearly 90% of Shinigami never reached. Gojo, on the other hand, despite all his talent, was currently unable to enter in contact with the soul of his sword. The way for a Shinigami to contact her sword was to go through a special kind of meditation called Jinzen. But despite all his tries, even though he could feel the soul of his sword, he was simply unable to communicate with it. Gojo understood his problem and was simply helpless toward it. It wasn't a question of talent, but his own disposition. He knew that deep down, he was rejecting the sword. A Zanpakuto was supposed to be a partner, a friend, the closest and most reliable companion a Shinigami could have in its entire life. But Satoru Gojo did not need to have a companion. In his entire life, there was only one man he could call as such: Suguru Geto, his best friend, and a man he had to personally put down once he went to the dark side. Since then, no one could ever catch up to his footsteps. He was the strongest sorcerer, the one who stood at the top. This was his pride. This was his deepest conviction. Even after dying and coming into this world, he still held the same conviction. That was why his heart stayed closed off from his Zanpakuto. But even though he knew the source of the problem, there was nothing he could do about this. Being stumped because of some bullshit-like emotions is truly a pain. Scratching his hair, he walked alone in the deserted alley before stopping as he looked at 4 men, wearing the standard uniform of the academy, standing in front of him. "Yo, what might be the matter? Just so you know, I am not interested in men." The 4 men seemed ticked at his nonchalance. "Satoru Gojo, is this how you talk to your senpai? Am I perhaps about to be bullied? Oh, I must say this is really a new experience. So, my dear little senpai, for what do I owe you the pleasure of this visit?" "You! Stop. No need to enter his game." The most rash one was stopped by a slender black-haired man with the number 69 on his left cheek. Then, facing Gojo, he continued, "My name is Shuhei Hiseiji, a 6th-year student from Class 1. While I do admit that the way we appeared might have seemed a little misleading, and for that I apologize, I also believe that your disrespectful words were unwarranted. Could you please apologize as well?" Gojo could see that the man was really sincere. I really hate this type. He could already see that despite his punk-like appearance, this guy was the noble type. Not noble in terms of bloodline, but in terms of actions and way of thinking. They were the kind of people who believed that there were no genuinely evil people and all that bullshit of this kind. Gojo tended to call this kind of people kind hypocrites. He didn't hate them per se, but the problem with kind hypocrites was that once their beliefs were broken, they tended to become, let's say, slightly extreme. He understood more than anyone. After all, Geto had also been this type. The type of man that said words like protecting the weak, following their duties, and all that righteous bullshit. And in the end, it was the same man who decided that the world could only be saved by exterminating all non-sorcerers. Even at his very last moment, before Satoru killed him, Geto could simply lament at how much he could not support the world. the world will always be an unkind place for the righteous. Thinking about his dead friend once again, his good mood vanished and simply nodded. Sorry. You guys are truly sensitive. Can't even take a joke, sigh. I see. Well, I guess I will take this apology. As Gojo thought, despite how his appearance suggested otherwise, Shuhei was truly a pacific man that hated conflict and bloodshed. Knowing that forcing the issue for a normal apology would only worsen the situation, he simply backed off and entered the heart of the issue. Satoru Gojo, if we stand here in front of you, it's because your actions have severely disturbed the peace of the academy. Many students have to complain about your, let's say, slightly troublesome attitude, and some male students also complained about your amorous habits. At this part, Shuhei coughed to hide his embarrassment. Seeing this, Gojo couldn't help but snicker. Aside from ditching class, Gojo wasn't idle when it came to wooing girls. After all, he couldn't simply study all the time, right? In fact, he even thought he was pretty tame compared to most university students back on Earth. So, Shuhei managed to calm down and continued, I understand that it's your freedom to act as you wish. For the second issue, no one here is a child. As such, while I personally find this practice deplorable, I have neither the right nor the intention to stop it as long as the concerned parties gave their consent. There he becomes even more serious. But about the main issue, your comportment is without a doubt setting a bad example for the students. You may perhaps not need those classes, but for the normal students, seeing someone succeed without putting any effort while they give their all is disheartening and affects their studies. So in short, a bunch of whining bastards couldn't face reality and came to complain so that I will become a model student and at least heal their wounded egos while giving them the illusion that they aren't just useless trash. Is that it? Shuhei's face twitched. Even though the words used by Gojo were extremely harsh, the truth was as he depicted. What's more, most of the students complaining were nobles who couldn't accept that someone from the Rukongai could surpass them so much without even trying. Shuhei didn't come here without doing his research on Gojo. He even knew about the short fight against the Hakuda and Shuinpo instructor, and such, understood that judging Satoru with their standards was simply stupid. He could not understand the use of such jealousy. If you felt inferior, wouldn't it be better to double, triple, or even quadruple the amount of effort you put in so that you could reach your goal? Ever since he had been saved from a hollow attack all those years ago by the ex-captain of the 9th Division, Kensei Muguruma, Shuhei had never ceased to put in the effort necessary to reach his idol. He even went as far as tattooing the same number 69 on his body, though on his cheek rather than his chest. Even the fact that Kensei was now considered a traitor and a fugitive alongside many other captains didn't change his admiration. This was why he could not understand people who used excuses to hide their own mediocrity. But even so, I understand your frustration. But please, for the sake of the academy, stop your conduct. While saying that, he gave a deep bow. Watching him like this, Gojo lowered his glasses before giving his smirk. Shuhei Hisagi, was it? Hehe. Did you know? If a bow was all that was necessary to make any requests, the world would truly be a different place. Putting back his glasses on, he put his hands in his pockets and swaggered past the bowing Hisagi without any care in the world. Before turning in the corner, he gave some last words. I respect your words and your way of thinking, but I will never force myself for the sake of people I do not recognize. Trust me, it isn't worth it. This was his creed. He wasn't a hero, nor was he even a good person. He didn't fight for something illusory like justice, nor did he wish to become an example for anyone. He simply lived his life as he wished, uncaring to anyone else. After his fight with the instructor and the short episode with Shuhei, it seemed that the academy had completely given up on him. Had it been a normal university, he would have been expelled long ago for misconduct. But that wasn't the case here. Since the difference in talent between Shinigami could go from one extreme to another, they were given larger freedom in organizing their schedule. It was just that there has never been a student like Satoru who simply ditched classes. Of course, there was a catch to this freedom. The more you missed classes, the harder your graduation exam to pass in the next year would be. After all, if you had the skills to miss classes, it meant that you weren't at the same level as a normal student. It was because he knew that what he was doing wasn't against the rules that he had dared to be so brazen. After all, getting expelled would go against his objective. Since then, the days passed and were rarely the same. After a while, He simply stopped coming to classes altogether. But no one came to bother him anymore. Sometimes he would study in the library. Sometimes he would be busy teasing some girls or bothering Nanao when she came to visit him. During the evening, he would spar with Toshiro or give some instructions to Momo and Hato. When he was free, he would eat some sweets or simply gaze at the sky while laying down in the garden of the academy. For everyone else, he was just ditching and playing around. But only those close to him understood how frightening he was slowly becoming. His mastery over Kido had already reached a bottleneck, but his recreation of Limitless was showing no sign of advancing. Still, if the current Gojo had to face him from the time he entered the Soul Society, he would completely destroy his past self. Currently sitting cross-legged under a tree, Gojo closed his eyes while having his sword on his lap and tried once again to communicate with his sword to no avail. What frustrated him was that he could feel that the sword was indeed trying to reach him, but he was simply unable to enter his inner world and see or hear the Zanpakuto's spirit. This frustrated him so much that he felt like he should simply stop wasting his time with this useless junk. The moment he thought so, all connection was immediately cut off. He couldn't even feel the sword trying to reach him anymore. Shit. For Satoru, his current failure was something he could not accept. I should really stop wasting my time. Limitless is the most important. The sword can come in later. Thinking so, he put the sword back in its sheath before placing it next to him and laid back against the trunk of a tree in thought. What was limitless? In the simplest way possible, it was a technique that allowed him to bring the concept of infinity into reality and distort space at will. In the past, he had divided this technique into 3 basic phases. The neutral phase. This was in a way the strongest defensive technique in his previous world, since it brought the concept of an infinite distance between him and anything. Thanks to this technique, he was theoretically untouchable, but if that was really the truth, then he wouldn't be dead. Like all techniques, infinity had its own weakness. Like, for example, curse-breaking weapons or other ability to manipulate space, such as the curse technique lapse, which brought the concept of negative distance into reality, allowing him to draw everything toward him or a specific point by generating a magnetic-like force. If he could use this technique, he would be the nemesis of all Shuinpa users. Finally, the curse technique reversal, which brought the concept of divergence into reality and created a repelling effect, making it the complete opposite of. Red was far more complicated than blue, and he nearly died before learning it. Thankfully, once he learned these 2, he was able to use the advanced technique, colliding limitless. If infinity was his strongest shield, then purple was his strongest spear. Man, just thinking about this is giving me a headache. Even now he didn't understand why he could use the Rakugan, but not limitless. This was really something that stumped him. Nonetheless, he knew that it shouldn't be too hard for him. All he lacked was a crucial step, something that could serve as a cornerstone. He already had more or less an idea about what he should do. He needed to create the equivalent of a reverse curse technique. This would be the first step. Growl rubbing his growling stomach, he stood up and decided that he needed to eat something. First year Class 1 homeroom. While Gojo was agonizing about his powers, the students of Class 1 were sent into an uproar as the homeroom teacher announced that they would be sent to the human world the next morning. For most of them, it had been decades if not centuries since they had died, and as such, it could be said that they all wished to see what the current world looked like. Now then, each of you should come and pick a ticket. This will determine which team you will belong to. Hearing this, Hinamori raised her hand. Sorry to disturb you, teacher, but one of our classmates, Gojo Satoru, is currently absent. Should we call him? This will not be necessary. Because of his conduct, it has been decided in order to prove himself, Satoru Gojo will be alone, and this exercise will also serve as a test for him. Should he fail, he will be expelled. But, do not make me repeat myself. Understood. Hinamori could only sit back with frustration while the other students began to snicker, happy to know that they might never have to see that infuriating face again. Still, she didn't worry for Gojo. She knew very well that he could basically graduate. She was just unhappy at the treatment he was receiving. Looking at all the gloating students, she could only hide her anger. I am sure he is going to show them all. Shino Academy. On a podium stood 3 students. One man was in the front while one woman and another man were behind him. Further behind them was a closed door that seemed to float in the air. It was the Senkamen, the official gate that people of the Soul Society could use to enter the living world. After making sure that all the first-year students of Class 1 were present, the one standing in front finally opened his mouth. I will first introduce myself. I am Shuhei Hiseiji, a 6th-year student. Behind me are Kanazawa and Aoga, my fellow classmates. Today, the three of us will lead you. An uproar sounded as most of the first-year students were astonished. Renji, who generally didn't pay attention to what was happening in the academy, couldn't help but mumble. What the heck? They are acting like those three are some kind of stars. What? You don't know? Kira, who usually stayed silent, couldn't help but exclaim. Should I? HAA. Forget it. Anyway, the uproar is mainly because of that guy. Shuhei Hiseiji. His entry in the GOJO 13 is already a foregone conclusion. In fact, it's even said that he would directly obtain a seated position once he enters. Whistle asterisk, seems like he is really a big deal. What do you think, Gojo? Yon asterisk, I just think that having to wake up so soon is a crime. Toshiro on the side commented dumbfounded. Nissan, this is the normal time for classes. And this is why it's a crime. The guy who made that schedule is really a demon. The others could only laugh bitterly. They were already used to Gojo's laid-back manner. Still, are you sure you will be all right alone? Do you even know how to do a soul burial? It was just explained to us. Haha, no worries. It's me after all. The others could only nod while Renji watched with admiration. Even though he always showed a brash personality, the truth of the matter was that, deep down, he had always lacked confidence in himself. But he could see none of that in Gojo. His words weren't just bragging, but born from a supreme confidence in himself. Silence, please. From the podium, Hataru silenced the student before continuing. From now on, aside from one of you, all the rest will act in teams of 3. Saying so, she sent a pointed look to Gojo, who could only scratch the back of his head sheepishly. After their one time together, they did pass some other moments again, but neither of them really felt any spark between them. This was even more so since Hataru knew that Gojo had relationships with other students. The only saving grace was that Gojo had never tried to play her like a fiddle, and as such their relationship was still all right. Momo, what's wrong? Toshiro asked as he looked at a blushing Momo. And no, nothing. Haha. Momo could only awkwardly laugh. Her room was close to Gojo and she could see the string of women visiting him. In fact, she knew that even some first-year girls were part of the lot. It had to be said that whatever the era, bad boys would always have a certain attraction for women. This created some very weird moments for her that would cause her to blush in shame whenever she remembered them. Anyway, guys, how were you paired? I am with Momo and Renji. Meanwhile, Kira is with 2 other students. They are. No need to tell me. It isn't like I will remember their names. Gojo dismissed and began to walk away. He didn't care about people who had nothing to do with him. This was just a waste of time and energy. Now then, does everyone have their hell butterflies? If so, let's go. All the students nodded, while a plethora of black and purple butterflies appeared around next to them. Watching the butterfly landing on his shoulder, Gojo could only marvel. It seemed that this little thing was the equivalent of phones here, since they served as communication devices. Well, in a way they are also GPS, haha. Gojo joked inwardly. Those butterflies were necessary guides when using the Senkamen. Without them, chances were that one would get lost in the Dong-ai. The Dong-ai was a sort of alternate dimensional passage that connected the Soul Society and the human world. It also floated in the Garganta, another void dimension that connected the human world, the Soul Society, and the Hueco Mundo. Gojo had done his research, but he had to admit that creating the limitless without a trigger would be hard. Perhaps I will find the answer in the Hueco Mundo or the Dong-ai. What's more, from some records he knew, the Dong-ai was a zone where time flowed 2,000 times faster than in the outside world. Well, this is a question for another time. As he was now, using the Dong-ai or the Hueco Mundo would only be suicide. Getting erased by a kotatsu in the Dong-ai or eaten by a hollow in the Hueco Mundo wasn't on his to-do list. Thinking so, he began to walk alongside the students and finally passed through the Senkamen. Human Realm, Japan, Naruki City. The passage through the Senkamen was pretty fast. In fact, from the traveler's perspective, one simply had to open the door, step through a room, and open the other door. The fact that Senkamen could be opened with any Zanpakuto showed that whoever created them had some deep mastery over space travel. The moment all the students stepped through the door and appeared on the roof of a large building, Shuhei began to speak. This is Naruki City. This city is under the jurisdiction of the 10th Division. For today's exercise, all the hollows have been completely swept away to avoid any problem. So do not worry. All the students nodded and began to observe the city. Currently, even though they left the Soul Society in the morning, the moon hung in the sky of the human world. This clearly showed that there was some shift in time. Shuhei found it a little weird, since it wasn't supposed to happen normally if the gate was well created. But he wasn't worried either, as, while rare, it was something that could happen. That's why passing through the Senkamen was necessary, since it was possible to be sent far in the past if you were lucky, or completely erased by the current of time 90% of the time if you passed through by Dong-ai. While Shuhei began explaining how the exercise would be going on, GOJO, who separated himself from the other students, took off his blindfold and took a deep breath before observing the city. So this is really a different world and time. Even though this was indeed Japan, he could not feel an ounce of cursed energy. Cursed energy was born from the negative feeling of humans. He knew that the Second World War had just ended, so this period should have been one of the most active with curses. Still, it was both funny and sad that no matter which world, humans would always find a way to wage war. Still, even though there was no cursed energy, this is so horrible, Momo murmured after coming next to him. Indeed, as far as the eyes could see, rows and rows of ghosts could be seen here and there roaming. Ghosts or spirits who stayed in the mortal humans for too long because of their lingering attachments could eventually transform into hollows once their chains of fate were corroded or be eaten by one. Thankfully, the transition from spirit to hollow could take months, if not years, though becoming a hollow's meal was more of a question of luck. GOJO understood clearly that since the war ended not long ago, it was normal for so many souls to still linger on Earth. No wonder they are willing to send students. I guess having more help is always appreciated. While GOJO was laughing inwardly, Momo could only lament. Why do people always go to war? She couldn't really understand this. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone could simply be happy? GOJO scoffed at those naive thoughts. Religion, ideology, resources, land, spite, love, or just because. No matter how pathetic the reason is, it's enough to start a war. It's human nature to pursue strife. Saying so, he put back on his blindfold and began to walk away, rather than thinking about something useless like a world without war. You should think of how to become stronger. Momo lowered her head at his admonishing tone. Renji, who stood on the side, wanted to speak, but Histogea stopped him with a shake of his head. He knew very well that behind his easygoing exterior, his big brother was someone who was extremely cold, almost uncaring even. What's more, he wasn't saying this to make Momo feel bad, but to seriously advise her. Satoru GOJO, where are you going? Haha, I don't really know. I just found something really interesting. You guys can stay here and play around if you wish. Shuhei was incensed. This was a very important exercise, but this man was playing around. Even though it has been decided that he would take this exercise alone, it should have still been under the supervision of one out of the three of them. Satoru GOJO, I need you to stop. Now. Heh. Haha, catch me if you can. See ya. With those words, he literally vanished from their eyes. Shuhei could only widen his eyes at this sight. This speed had long surpassed what a normal Shuinpa should be able to. He had heard about his fight with the Shuinpa instructor, and had thought that it was just the instructor going easy on GOJO. But it seemed that he had been wrong. Gritting his teeth, he briefly considered giving up on GOJO. After all, he seemed strong, and he was acting like a nuisance. Finally, his sense of duty took over his feeling of indignation, and he decided to follow him. But just as he was about to, he was startled to find something missing. I can't feel his Ryatsu at all. How did he do it? Shuhei, what do we do? Hataru asked on the side while looking worriedly at the direction GOJO went to. Like Shuhei, she was unable to feel his Ryatsu anymore, though she was less surprised. After all, she had sometimes seen him completely suppress his energy while training, something that should be impossible since all Shinigami always leaked a minuscule amount of Ryatsu, even when they held back. Shuhei hesitated a little before finally shaking his head. We do not know where he is going, and following him blindly would be a waste of time. We will proceed with the exercise as planned. And if he isn't back before sunrise, we will ask the Soul Society to locate him through his hell butterfly. What if something happens to him? Do not worry. As I said, All the hollows in the area had been swept off. There shouldn't be any problem. Author's note flag. Under the moonlight, Gojo was using Shuinpa after Shuinpa to reach his target. He wasn't lying when he said that he had found something interesting. Shinigami were unable to completely hide their Ryatsu. From what he had seen with his eyes, even Soifan, the leader of the secret force, could only hide her Ryatsu partially. Not even him, with his absolute control over his energy thanks to his eyes, could do so. The best he could do was to lower the emission of his Ryatsu to the level of a human, which made him nearly untraceable. The reason for that was because of nearly invisible vents in the wrist of all Shinigami from where their Ryatsu leaked. You could say that those vents were basically the noses of Ryatsu. There was just one little difference. For a human, having his nose blocked would just mean not being able to breathe for a short while. At most, you could also breathe with your mouth. For a Shinigami, having those vents blocked meant internal combustion and then death. Long story short, as long as you didn't want to die, you wouldn't stop all your Ryatsu from leaking. But here was the problem. When he used his eyes the moment he stepped on the roof, he saw two astonishing things. The first thing was a bunch of super huge and completely white hollows. From their masks to their bodies, everything was white. In all illustrations, he had never seen such things. The worst was that he couldn't feel them, and he couldn't really see them either. He could only see their energy. This meant that they would be invisible to the students. It wouldn't be a problem for one such hollow to appear. But an entire group? Even more so after the 10th Division supposedly killed all the hollows in the surroundings? The second thing he saw was two Shinigami, or at least he thought they were Shinigami. He couldn't feel them. He could only barely see the energy circulating in their body. What's more, they were also invisible to normal eyes. Still, those guys are strong. Really freaking strong. Even stronger than Soifan. He began to slow down while thinking about how he would resolve this situation. Meanwhile, two cloaked people were standing on a building while feeling the Ryatsu of the students. Someone is coming. The one who spoke was standing slightly behind the other man as if showing respect. Oh, indeed. It seems like someone is really coming. What a beautiful control of his energy. Is it a member of the secret corps? It shouldn't be. Only the students of the academy are in the zone. So, a student managed to see through Kasuke Urahara's specially created hiding cloaks. This was something beyond incredible. Ever since he had stolen some of the equipment created by Kasuke, he had never been caught when wearing this cloak. Not even a captain should have been able to feel him. This is interesting. Really interesting. Under his cloak, the gaze behind the glasses was gleaming with a chilly light. Should we kill him? As the man who was clearly the subordinate asked, he slowly brought his hand toward the short sword at his hip. Even though they were still a few kilometers away from each other, piercing and killing that lone student would be no problem. After all, aside from the commander, his Zanpakuto had the longest reach in all the Soul Society. The leader clearly hesitated, torn between his scientific curiosity and his careful reasoning. Finally, his curiosity won. Killing that student now would be easy, but what he was searching for was a way to surpass the inherent limitations of Shinigami. Even now he was still unable to find the Hogyoku created by Kasuke, and as such, his researches on the fusion between hollows and Shinigamis were still incomplete. It was sad that he hadn't been able to capture the captains who survived the hollow transformation 60 years ago. Once again, because of that damned Kasuke. That man is really the nemesis of my life. Well then, I initially wanted to see how those students would fare against the new experiments. But no matter. Don't kill him. We are going. Understood. Open the Garganta. At those words, the sky literally cracked open. Back to Gojo. He immediately stopped running when he saw this huge hole in the sky. Taking off his blindfold, his eyes widened in shock, as a huge beam of light fell from the hole and covered the two suspicious cloaked people before bringing them into the sky. In the shadow of that dimensional hole, wriggling forms wearing completely white masks could be seen. Minos Grande. Jillian? So those two are Ajuchas or Vasto Lord. Minos was a classification of hollows who, in order to become stronger, stopped chasing souls, but rather began to eat each other. 3 classifications were given. Jillian's, then Ajuchas, and finally Vasto Lord, whose powers were said to be equal or slightly higher than a captain. So this beam of light is the negation? While this black hole is Garganta. An excited smile formed on his face as he watched it, before he finally began to laugh loudly. Finally, freaking finally. He didn't even care anymore about who those cloaked figures were, nor did he care about anything else. Seeing it once was enough. The Hueco Mundo really held the way for him to recreate Limitless. He just needed a way to travel between dimensions. Just as he was about to bathe in this feeling of euphoria, boom, the world rocked as the group of white hollows which previously stood around the two figures reached and circled around him. The combined spiritual pressure was so high that the world itself seemed to tremble. But for Gojo, none of that mattered. Looking at those hollows, all he saw was a bunch of training dummies. This is going to be fun. After all, nothing was better than a true fight to test the skills he created. GOJO 13, 10th Division Barak. Captain. It's an emergency. A black-haired Shinigami was running hurriedly with a frightened expression. He opened the door of the captain's office without even introducing himself. The detectors signaled an anomaly in space in the human world and are going crazy. They also detected an abnormally large concentration of Ryastu in the city. Ishin, who was lying down and relaxing, and Ranjaku, who was seated on the captain's seat while working on a mass of papers, both raised their heads in shock at the sudden entrance. The information was crucial, but more than anything, they remembered that the first-year students of Class 1 were supposed to be in that very city. Shit, Ranjaku. Roger, leave it to me, Captain. Ranjaku didn't even need him to finish his sentence, and got up before rushing towards the Senkamen set in their barracks. Because of their power, the procedures necessary for a captain and a vice-captain to visit Earth were completely different from normal Shinigami. The moment she passed the gate, a tattoo in the form of the insignia of the 10th Division formed on her right breast, before becoming invisible. This tattoo was an obligation and would limit her power level to a fifth of her full power, but it was necessary to keep the equilibrium in the human world. What's more, the transfer between the two dimensions wasn't instantaneous. I hope that I won't reach them too late. The fact that the 10th Division would be responsible if anything happened aside. She couldn't accept to leave a bunch of students to their death. Still, it wasn't as if everything was hopeless. She remembered that the student named Gojo Satoru should be part of the group. From the information she had, he was already quite strong. Let's hope that everything is all right. Human world, Naruki City. Meanwhile, on the students' side, while all of them were doing the exercises of sending souls to the other side, they all stopped as they felt a crushing power on them, even though they couldn't find the source, meaning that the cause of it was quite far. This didn't bring them any relief, as this meant that despite the distance, those beings were strong enough to be felt from far away. Shuhei Hisagi was briefly stunned before his expression became grave. Don't panic. Everything will be all right. He took his butterfly and sent a message before watching it disappear. As students, their Zanpakuto did not receive the permission to open a Senkamen. They needed to ask for help once they were finished. Now, though, it was clearly an emergency. Taking a deep breath, he calmed himself and continued. Hataru Aoba. Yes, I need you to take care of the students here. What about you? Student Gojo is still somewhere. I need to find him. What's more, I also need to take a look at the situation and make a report of the situation. Hataru and Aoga wanted to protest, but they knew that now wasn't the time. They needed to secure the students and wait for help. Wait, Hisagi-senpai. I am going. I can recognize Gojo's Ryatsu. Just as he was about to use Shuinpa and rush towards the source, he was stopped by a female voice. Turning around, he immediately recognized her, since she was the best student of the first year in Kido. Student Hinamori. I am sorry, but I am also going. He was once again interrupted by another student. Looking at the short silver-haired boy, Shuhei sighed. You are making me waste time, Student Hitsugaya. Since we are wasting time, why don't we just go? Renji and Kira also advanced. Looking at them, Shuhei was feeling proud that such people were students and most likely his future colleagues if they didn't die. Because of this, he was even more adamant about refusing. Are you even able to use Shuinpa? This question stumped them. After all, not everyone was a freak like Gojo who could master Shuinpa in less than 2 weeks and even create a technique based on it. They also understood that without Shuinpa, they would only be dead weight in this situation. Looking at each other dejectedly, they were about to back when Toshiro raised his hand. It's still rough, but I can use it. Not only Shuhei, but even the other students who were watching from the side were shocked. In the first place, none of the Zankinsoki was supposed to be learned in the first year. After all, the final goal at the end of the 6 years course was only to reach the level of practitioners. Hitsugaya being able to use Shuunpa now meant that it wouldn't be weird for him to graduate early. Seeing this, Shuhei bit his lips before deciding that they had wasted too much time. Let's go. Then, the two of them immediately vanished. Looking at the now empty space, Momo clenched her fists in frustration. Shiro-chan Gojo. Good luck. The fact that this was all she could do was so frustrating. She wished for more power. She wished to become stronger. She did not want to have this feeling of helplessness ever again. Unbeknownst to her, those feelings made her Zanpakuto shake slightly, as if trying to reach her. Human World, Karakura Town. Naruki City and Karakura Town were neighbors. In a rather sparsely decorated shop, one man wearing a green and white hat sat peacefully with a teapot in his hands. Looking at the moon, he sighed after taking a sip. The moon is so beautiful, but it seems like trouble is brewing. Next to him, a black cat was laying lazily as if it didn't care about the man's muttering. Then, stretching, it slowly stood up before looking in the direction of Naruki City. Are you going? The man asked. I am just bored. Might as well see what the fuss is about. Surprisingly, the cat answered with a deep voice. Anyone else seeing this scene would have jumped in fright, but the man did not seem surprised. Well, just be careful. It could be a trap. The cat looked at him with disdain. Who do you take me for? Even after 60 years without training, I am still the fastest, you know? No one can catch me. Saying so, the cat immediately vanished. Now alone, the man let out a laugh, haha, as prideful as always. But I guess the title of Flash Goddess isn't for show. Taking another sip of his tea, he stood up and adjusted the hat on his head. Now then, I guess I should go visit Shinji and the others. Then with a burst of speed, he also vanished. Human World, Naruki City. Standing in the middle of a horde of hollows, Gojo did not feel an ounce of fear. For as long as he remembered, he had never feared something as trifling as death. Taking off his blindfold completely, his eyes began to shine as if they were jewels. It's time to take this a little more seriously. At that moment, an overpowering aura began to emanate from him while covering the hollows completely. His Ryastu, that should have been blue, began to take a black hue as lightning formed around him. Bairi 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 boom. Before those mindless hollows could even understand what was happening, one of them was kicked away and propelled a few meters in the sky before landing with a thud. Its mask was already showing cracks, and its aura was so chaotic that it couldn't move properly anymore. Still, even though it was incredible, TCH, I wanted to end them in one hit. He felt incredibly displeased to see that hollow surviving. Breaking the sound barrier, he avoided a hit from behind and appeared at the top the one who tried to take him down. Hello. When the hollow tried to raise its head, bye-bye. Gojo brought down his fist. Boom. This time he held nothing back and was satisfied at the view of the mask completely breaking off under his fist. Haha, now we are talking. Destroying that hollow had been so exhilarating. How could he stop now? Roar. The hollows seemed to go mad. All this while, it has been them terrorizing Shinigami. Looking at the hollow that foregoed all defense and punched towards him, Gojo yawned. It was so slow in his eyes. He could already see how to avoid it and kill that hollow in one blow. But then this fight was for him to practice, right? Pushing his hands together, he murmured. Stretching his right hand, a shield made of light appeared between him and the hollow, completely negating the impact of the shock. Not wishing to waste any more time on it, Gojo continued. A red beam flashed and evaporated the upper half of the body of the hollow. Even though a Heido in the 30s was nothing much, in the hand of someone like Gojo, it was just a perfect weapon of destruction. For an instant, Gojo felt as if he was once again on Earth, using the cursed technique Red, but he knew that they just looked alike. Sighing, he took out his sword and, gathering lightning on it, slashed. Swoosh, another hollow was immediately cut in two from head to toe. Shaking his head, he began to count 3, 6, 8, 12, 20. Only 20 of you guys remain. Sai, try to entertain me more at least, okay? Some of the hollows began to take a step back. In their long life, it was the first time in a long while they had felt such a deep fear when facing another being. Unable to take it, all of them backed away before flying away at full speed in directions. Standing on the ground and looking at this scene, Gojo could only widen his eyes in surprise. Huh? For real? He had been so sure that those hollows were nothing more than mindless beasts that he did not even think of the possibility of them running away. And flying. Gojo frowned. He knew that in the human world where the erasure particles were looser, they basically created ground for them to walk or runs on in the sky. But since it was close to impossible in the Soul Society, he had never seen anyone do it, and it couldn't be taught to first-year students either. What's more, looking around him, he could only see utter devastation. Thankfully, it was an inhabited zone, so there were no victims. But still, he could only scratch his head in embarrassment. Whoever you are, could you get out, please? Oh, you managed to find me? This sentence seems so familiar. Looking at the intruder, he smiled. Heh, talking cat, is it? He didn't seem particularly surprised, something the cat remarked. It's the first time someone wasn't shocked at my appearance. Haha, sorry, but I have seen things way more surprising. His previous teacher had a walking and talking plushly. Compared to that, a talking cat was nothing that outlandish, even though the said cat seemed to hide an insane amount of power. So, Mr. Cat, why were you spying on me? The cat didn't answer, but rather looked pointedly at him. The distance between the shop and this place might be large, but for someone like it who could move at supersonic speed, it was nothing. As such, it had been able to observe the fight from the beginning. What the hell are they teaching students at the academy nowadays? If the one fighting had been a vice captain or a captain, then it wouldn't have been surprised. But a student, it suddenly began to doubt life. Did the Soul Society grow so much in just 60 years? So you are related to the Shinigami? As for your question, let me correct you on one thing. Smiling, with his eyes full of confidence, he enunciated slowly. I don't know how the Soul Society was 60 years ago or whatever, but in this world, I am unique. Looking at this smug face, all feelings of awe vanished from the cat's mind, and one thought replaced it. I want to punch him. In a deserted and nearly destroyed part of the city, a cat and a man were facing each other. Did anyone ever tell you that you are infuriating? Nah, they are too busy staring at my handsome face to care. Haha. The urge to punch this man grew even more in its heart. But at the same time, it couldn't help but feel that this man was very interesting. What's more, he reminded it of its best friend, Kasuke Urahara. This man and Kasuke would either become best friends or the worst enemies. Why don't you chase after those hollows? Scratching his head, Gojo answered awkwardly. I don't know how to fly. The rustle of the winds could be felt clearly. The sole reason it still bothered talking to that man was because of how curious it was, and also the fact that all those hollows were still on its radar. Even though they were hard to spot for most people, it was a specialist in tracking and killing. As for Gojo, the truth of this matter was that he was quite nonchalant by nature. Even though he wasn't cruel enough to look at innocent people getting pulled in this situation, he wasn't bursting with a spirit of justice either. Talking with that mysterious cat was way more interesting for now. The cat, on the other hand, was completely dumbfounded before nodding in understanding. It had been so surprised by the power this boy was showing that it had forgotten the boy was still a student. Well, it isn't that hard. Saying so, the cat began to walk toward Gojo, but at its third step. Oh! Gojo exclaimed as he saw the cat's step resting in the air. Then after a few steps, it was basically standing in the sky. At least that's what it looked like for normal people. But for Gojo, so this is how it works. In his eyes, he could see bluish spiritual particles floating in the air, gathering under the feet of the cat. It was a little surprising to see a cat use spiritual power like this. But once again, this wasn't much for him. The plushie aside, he even knew a panda that could speak and use cursed energy so well. The cat, on the other hand, was astonished once again. This skill wasn't a hard skill by any means, but it hadn't even explained anything yet. Is it those eyes? It could feel that those eyes were in no way normal. In the first place, why was this guy so handsome? Shaking its head, it continued. Flying necessitates the use of erasure. Even though the only race that can really make use of erasure are the Quincy, simply gathering it under our feet isn't hard. Though it's near impossible in the Soul Society or the Hueco Mundo. Even though he already knew all this, he couldn't help but muse. Say, if someone could manipulate all the erasure as they wished, wouldn't he become the god of the Soul Society? The cat simply looked at Gojo in silence before sighing. Why do I only meet the crazy ones? It could only mourn its luck. On the other side of the town, Shuhei Hisagi was also mourning his luck, though for far more life-threatening reasons. Huff 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 currently. Isagi and them were being surrounded by 3 hollows of the likes never seen before. They didn't know from where they appeared from, but it was clear that those 3 were initially fleeing from something else. Now, how do we escape from this? He thought bitterly as he tightened the grip on his sword. The situation was dire, and he did not know when help would come. What's more, even though he had managed to avoid the claws of one hollow which aimed for his head, a part of his chest was still pierced, and he was bleeding profusely. Hitsugaya, meanwhile, wasn't faring that much better. Even though he was a genius, it was still his first real fight. Because of this, at first, he had been too stiff and received many wounds that he could have avoided normally. Because of the stress and his bleeding wounds, Toshiro could already feel his mind becoming slower. Ha ha ha, I am so lame. Murmuring to himself, he bit his lips hard as blood began to leak. He had been all gung-ho about going to find GOJO. He had thought that with his current level, he wouldn't be a dead weight like the last time with Momo. Author's note, Nero. But the reality was so disappointing that it was laughable. I am sorry. Nisen Momo, it seems like this is the end for me. Is this all you amount to? Just as he was about to give up, a deep rumble sounded in his mind. Who are you? A cold wind went past him. And when Toshiro turned around, he wasn't in the city anymore, but rather in a tundra entirely covered in ice. Before he could even understand what was happening, he slowly raised his head and looked at the huge serpent-like dragon entirely made out of ice that was looking down at him. I have seen you in my dreams. Who are you? My name is... What? He didn't understand why, but he wasn't able to hear the full sentence. Is it still too soon? Is it really all you amount to? Are you going to give up like this? Without accomplishing anything? What do you know? Toshiro grew incensed. He wasn't stupid and understood that this ice dragon was most likely the spirit of his Zanpakuto. Still, he couldn't accept being berated like this when he had clearly given his all. The dragon scoffed. If you have really given your all, if you really used everything at your disposal, then why do you still fear me? Toshiro fell silent. All his life, he had lived in loneliness, with only Momo and his grandmother being the few sources of warmth in this world. In the past, he didn't understand why, but after joining the academy, he understood that he was born with a rare kind of Ryatsu that was already attuned to an element. Ice. The reason he was always alone and why people feared him was simply because of a power he did not even know the origin of. This was so pitiful and laughable. Let me ask you, even if you survive now, do you think you will be of any help next time? Those words shook him. Why did he train? Because he wished to become stronger. Because he wished to protect those he loved. But more than anything, he wished to be accepted by the one he began to admire more than anyone else in the world. Thank you. Tell me, what may I call you? My name is... Back in the real world, from Shuhei's perspective, it was as if Toshiro suddenly stopped moving for no reason. Roar! Of course, the hollows didn't miss this occasion, and 2 of them rushed towards Toshiro at full speed, ready to devour him. Hitsugaya! Shuhei screamed helplessly at this. He wanted to jump in, but the 3rd hollow was stopping him. But, just as the inevitable was about to happen, Toshiro slowly opened his eyes. Sit upon the frozen heavens, Haya Rinmaru. The world seemed to be suddenly encased in snow and ice. Sit upon the frozen heaven, Haya Rinmaru. The moment Toshiro uttered those words, the temperature around them dropped sharply while snow and ice could be seen slowly forming in the surrounding area. In his hand, his sword changed considerably, becoming far longer with a star-like hilt and a chain at the end. His transformation and his obvious increase in power startled the 2 hollows, but they didn't stop and tried to devour him. Author's note, Kinky. For any normal Shinigami, just awakening the Shurkai wouldn't bring notable change aside from the change in the shape of the sword and increase in Ryatsu. After all, just knowing the name didn't mean you could bring out the power in your sword. Unfortunately for those 2, Toshiro Hitsugaya wasn't a normal Shinigami. The very moment he uttered his sword name, Toshiro knew. His sword did not have a complicated power, nor did it have some complicated skills. It could do only one thing, manipulating water and changing it into ice. He was truly the ruler of the frozen heavens. Looking at those 2 hollows which suddenly became too slow in his eyes, Toshiro merely waved the chain of his sword and trapped the 2 hollows with it. The 2 hollows roared as they fought back and tried to escape, but it is useless. Raising his sword, he brought down in one mighty swing. Show them your might. Ruhar. What answered him was the roar of a giant dragon made out of ice that rushed toward the two trapped hollows and completely eradicated them. Huff, 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 did you see that, Nissan? I succeeded. Covered in sweat, Toshiro murmured as the sword chain of the sword vanished, though the sword did not go back to its common Asachi-like appearance. Now it could really be said to be the sword that belonged only to him. This was the first time Toshiro had used his shuriken. When added with all the wounds he received previously, his mind became foggy and unable to hold down. Just as he was about to fall, a silver-haired man appeared next to him and caught him before gently laying him down. Yo, Nissan. Haha, I saw everything. I guess I should say good job, kiddo. Now, let me deal with the remaining trash before we continue. Okay? Toshiro nodded before closing his eyes and falling unconscious. Looking at the exhausted small boy, Gojo gave a rare heartfelt smile rather than his usual mocking grin. Though, the moment he stood up, that smile immediately vanished and was replaced by a cold and unsettling grin. Saying so, he put his hand in his pocket nonchalantly and proceeded to advance toward the hollow that the dumbfounded Shuhei was keeping away with difficulty. I guess I have to also say good job to you. You were pretty useless, but at least you have a sense of responsibility. Laughing lightly, he walked past Shuhei and stood in front of the unmoving hollow. Be it Shuhei or the hollow, neither of them could move. They felt as if they were facing a giant monster that shouldn't exist. The pressure placed on them was so high that it felt as if the world itself was trying to crush them. Touching the mask of the hollow, Gojo muttered, I played around too much, and because of that, Toshiro got beat up pretty bad. Then again, he finally awakened his Zanpakuto thanks to you. So I guess thank you? A blue light gathered on Gojo's finger before piercing the mask of the hollow and as such, purifying it. Watching the fading hollow and feeling the absence of the insane pressure Gojo emanated, Shuhei slumped on the ground powerlessly. He couldn't believe what he had seen. Not only was one first-year student able to awaken his Zanpakuto just 1 month after entering the academy, but there was another one even more freakish who could literally paralyze him with just his spiritual pressure. Gojo took a look at the sweating Shuhei and said, well, I have to go, take care of the remaining pests. Wouldn't be funny if something happened to Momo. As for you, stay here and take care of Shiro. Well then, see ya. Waving his hand, Gojo simply vanished with a shuanpa. Once again too fast for Shuhei to understand. Giving a bitter smile, Shuhei shook his head. What have I been doing during those 6 years? It wasn't as if he was a super genius, but he was no slouch either. Perhaps all the praise he received made him swell? Lowering his head to look at his sword, Shuhei gripped it tightly before swearing. When I go back to the Soul Society, I will put more work into knowing your name. Meanwhile, in the sky, rushing toward another target, the black cat that went unnoticed by Shuhei murmured, You have been pretty harsh with that kid. Gojo shrugged, I do not bother with weaklings. But I hate people who could become strong, but waste their potential. If he doesn't awaken even after that, then that's simply all he will amount to. I see. I thought that this guy was merely an infuriating braggart, but I must reassess my opinion. In its long life, it had seen hundreds of so-called geniuses. It itself was one, Kasuk, and basically, all the people at captain level were people who could be called geniuses. That's why, for it, what mattered the most was the personality. After all, weren't they bought out of the Soul Society after falling in the traps of another terrifying genius? This guy, though, was different. Neither warm nor cold. Indifferent to the world and looking down on everything, but still caring for a selected few who fit his standards. A man who could watch innocent people die without any burden as long as he wasn't the cause. Someone who followed the rules as long as they did not clash against his own. This was the first time it had seen such a complex man. He is pretty interesting. Would such a man bow down to the irrational rule of the Central 46 or the nobles? After seeing this man, the black cat understood something. As long as he doesn't die too soon, the Soul Society will be faced with a storm. A few minutes later, just as he was about to rush and erase the last 2 hollows, Gojo stopped as he witnessed a blonde woman standing in front of his 2 preys. The cat next to him immediately vanished, but Gojo didn't care. Growl, hey Nico. The blade of her sword immediately dispersed into ash before completely shredding the 2 hollows into pieces. Whistle turning around, the woman's eyes widened as she stared at the incredibly handsome man standing in front of her. Thankfully, she had already seen the report about him and knew who he was. Hello. You must be Satoru Gojo. I am Ranjika Matsumoto, Vice Captain of the 10th Division. Are you alright? Gojo chucked before asking. Say, I have a burning question. Matsumoto tilted her head. The situation is pretty urgent. But I am listening. Well, I was just wondering. Doesn't your back hurt? Matsumoto didn't understand his question at first. But once she saw where he was looking, she swept her blonde hair aside before puffing her incredibly large chest while laughing. Ha ha ha. You wouldn't believe how heavy and sweaty these little babies can be. This time, it was Gojo's turn to be surprised. Did I meet someone more shameless than me? Standing with his hands in his pockets while facing the super big-breasted beauty in front of him, Gojo couldn't help but wonder, why does she seem incomplete? All in all, she was the third vice captain he had met, and while she was without a doubt the most powerful out of the three, he felt as if she should have been even more powerful. It was as if a big chunk of her very being had been bitten off, and the rest was somehow trying to patch itself. Well, this is getting interesting. Ranjiku, on the other hand, was also studying the man in front of her. She had been a little doubtful at first about the report on his power, but now that he stood there so nonchalantly, she had to admit that this man was incredibly powerful. The fact that he was an eye candy wasn't something she could cast aside either. So, handsome guy, could you make a summary of the situation? Nah, this ain't my job. Follow me. I will send you towards the one you should ask. Gojo knew that he would have to share all the information he had anyway, so might as well do it only once if possible. Well then, follow me. Saying so, he used Shuinpa and vanished. Ranjiku, initially baffled at how he went from leering at her to completely ignoring her, became even more astonished when she felt him move so fast and proceeded to follow. What followed was so boring that it was anticlimactic. Standing on the roof of a building, he watched as students organized themselves and all that. All of them seemed to feel relief since this ordeal was finished. What's more, they kept throwing glances at Gojo while he was observing them. They all knew that it was thanks to him that none of them died. They also heard how Toshiro awakened his Zanpakuto and thought that it was thanks to his teaching. This, more than anything, made them so envious they could die. After all, thousands of 10,000 Shinigamis never awaken their Zanpakuto. The simple fact that Toshiro did meant that he would be rewarded a seated position the moment he graduated, and he would clearly not take 6 years to graduate. Now then, is everyone all right? Hataru, who was keeping count of the students, nodded. Aside from Shuhei and Toshiro, the rest are all right. We are ready to go. So nothing more will happen? Gojo was more and more disappointed. After he had seen those two suspicious Shinigami or hollows, he had been expecting that something big would happen. Well, technically something big did happen. He was forced to concede this. After all, if he didn't exist, those hollows would have completely exterminated the students before help came. So their goal was the students. Gojo didn't believe in coincidences. The 10th Division had clearly been said to have swept this part of the town. So, on the day the students had an exam without any powerful Shinigami nearby, a group of super hollows of a kind never seen before appeared by magic? This means that those two are Shinigami? Shinigami ordering hollows. The situation was becoming far more dangerous than he thought. The smell of conspiracy was too thick. He couldn't help but scratch his head as he thought, man, and here I thought that after death, I would have fewer problems, but I am already swimming in plots? Come on. It hasn't even been 2 months since I am in this world. He couldn't help but curse his luck. Ranjiku, unaware of Gojo's thoughts, kept getting things in order as she thought about the report of the student Shuhei. Since the badge of all students would record the number and approximative strength of the hollow one killed, it was impossible to lie about it. Looking at the hair of Gojo and the sleeping Toshiro, then thinking about her infuriating friend and the Captain Yukatake, she couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. Does being silver-haired mean you are born as a genius? Discarding those useless thoughts, she informed the students. Now then, the class will be stopped here. We will now go back to the Soul Society. Are you ready? Yes. Okay, then let's go. Smiling, she took out her sword and pushed it in the void, thereby opening a Senkaman. Seeing this, Gojo gathered his energy on his fingers and began to scribble something on the ground before following the others as they left. On the roof now devoid of any Shinigami, a black cat suddenly appeared close to where Gojo sat previously. If Ranjiku could see this scene, she would be extremely astonished because, all along, she had never felt the presence of anyone else. Uncaring about how incredible its stealth was, The cat looked down on the ground where Gojo scribbled previously. What it could see was a bunch of words followed by a little illustration of Gojo waving his hand. The words said the following. Seems like I must go, Mr. Cat. Still, I memorized your Ryatsu. Next time I come into the human world, we will walk around. P.S. Cats are cute but dogs are better. The cat simply shattered the part of the roof and went away. Its tail kept swishing as it disdained to even entertain the boy's words. How could dogs be better than cats? After this, it vanished and a few moments later appeared in an old factory in Karakura town. There, alongside Kasuke stood another blonde-haired man. Kasuke Shinji. It seems like Aizen is acting again. I observed the hollows and they reek of his technique. Yo, Yoruchi. Why a woman like you keeps this cat form is beyond me. Oh, shut it, Shinji. I am already used to this form. Oh, ignoring the little squabble between his two friends, Kasuke took off his hat and asked, how were they? Understanding that now wasn't the time to play around, Yoruchi began to explain what she saw. Kasuke's smile slowly vanished as he entered deep in thoughts. Oi, Kasuke, don't stay silent. Shinji asked impatiently. Sorry. It's just, from what happened 60 years ago, we know that Aizen was trying to break the natural limits of our species by creating Shinigami, who had the characteristics of hollows. Saying so, he threw a careful glance at his friend. After all, Shinji was one of the victims of that experiment. Don't mind me. Continue. Then, as I was saying, Aizen most likely hit an impasse with that train of thought. After all, even captains and vice-captain levels are unable to survive the operation. At this, Shinji simply nodded. If back then Kasuke and his team didn't give their all to save his group, Shinji knew they wouldn't have lasted 3 days, much less 60 years. Since his experiment was clearly a failure, I think he decided to follow another road. Rather than creating Shinigami with hollow power, he is going to create hollows with Shinigami power. Well, not like he will succeed. The other two frowned. Why? I do not really understand his goals, but I can guess more or less. Just that without my Hogyoku, it's simply impossible for him to succeed. Shinji sighed in relief while Yoruchi said, we should destroy it. If we destroy it, there is simply no way he can succeed. Kasuke could only give a bitter smile. I tried, but I couldn't. The fact that his own creations surpassed his understanding was pretty frustrating. But still, you are right. We must destroy it. I will find a way no matter what. Now then, let's meet the others. They still need to be stabilized. At those words, the three of them entered the factory. When they came back from the outing, Ranjika told Gojo that he would be asked to make a complete report about his observations of the situation before swiftly leaving. As for the students, the instructors who were briefed about the situation were extremely sorry and decided to give them a full grade on this little test. Meanwhile, they could only look at Gojo with mixed emotions since they knew that if not for his presence, this would have most likely ended with a few deaths at best and a total wipeout in the worst-case scenario. After talking for a little while, the students were then dismissed. Walking alongside the usual group, Rinji was talking excitedly. You guys were so epic. Even from far away, we could feel your Ryatsu going wild. And Toshiro, when he awakened, the whole sky seemed to be covered in frost, and we could even hear a roar. For Rinji, who had always worshipped strength, the exploits of his friends were something that brought him a great sense of pride and envy. Toshiro wasn't with them, since he had been taken to the 4th Division for healing. After all, his wounds were not light. Initially, they wanted to follow, but Ranjika dissuaded them as the ground of the 4th Division was only allowed to wounded or members. Because of this, they had no other choice than simply waiting. Gojo was rather disappointed since he wished to see some Kaido spell in action, but since he already decided to join the 4th Division, he wasn't in a hurry. While talking, Rinji couldn't help but gently caress his sword. One day, I will also awaken my Shirkai, perhaps even the Bankai. Kira snickered at that. Awakening a Bankai means reaching the lowest threshold to become a captain. You think it's so easy? Shut it, okay? I am allowed to dream. The others laughed at his embarrassed expression. Oh yeah, I had told Rukia we were going to the human world. Now that we passed the test, let's meet her, okay? Gojo shrugged. Why not? Not like we have anything better to do. Yosh, let's go now. I can't wait to see her face once I tell her what happened. Shino Academy. In one of the classrooms, Rukia was currently facing a few men. Out of the group, 2 of them stood out particularly. One was a black-haired young man, while the other one was an old man whose hair was already completely white. In the Soul Society, where the souls could still look young after 1,000 years, it was hard to imagine just how old such a man could be. They were currently discussing something when the door was pushed open with a bang and Renji barged in. "Hey, Rukia, did you hear?" Renji's voice trailed off when he saw the group. Sighing, the young black-haired man addressed Rukia. "It seems that we have been interrupted. We will discuss later." Saying so, he did not spare Renji a look and began to walk away. Renji, meanwhile, was unable to move as sweat covered his face. He could feel pressure out of this world from the man. He felt like an ant facing a terrifying monster. But, just as he was about to step out of the room, he stopped dead in his tracks. Gojo, who was facing down the black-haired man, looked at him from head to toe and let out a whistle. "This white headpiece in your hair is really beautiful. So this is the Kensiken? What does a high-class noble want with our beautiful but slightly brutish Rukia?" While everyone else could barely speak because of the pressure, only Gojo could talk so nonchalantly. What's more, he released his own Ryatsu and countered the one emitted by the black-haired young man. "Oh!" Behind the young man, the old-looking man raised an eyebrow at this display of power. It didn't take long for him to pull out the information from his memory. "So this is Satoru Gojo? Oh ho, what a fearsome potential." The old man had absolutely no intention nor reason to intervene in this little clash. The young man, after feeling the power, finally looked properly at Gojo. "What's your name?" "Heh, you do know that you have to introduce yourself first before asking someone to do the same?" The man's eyes twitched. There were many things he wanted to say, but remembering the promises he made on the grave of his wife, he calmed down. "I am Byakuya Kachiki, 28th head of the Kachiki family. What about you?" Gojo wanted to leave some snarky comments, but he wasn't an unreasonable man. "Gojo Satoru." From the Rukongai, Byakuya didn't seem particularly surprised. Even though he had his pride as a noble, he never looked down on anyone because of their origins. Otherwise, he would have never married someone from the Rukongai despite all the complaints he received. He simply looked down at everyone by default until proven otherwise. "I will remember your name." Stopping there, Byakuya simply began to walk away. Once they were out of earshot, Byakuya asked the old man behind him, "Grandfather, what do you think?" The old man was none other than Jinrei Kachiki, one of the oldest members of the Godai 13 and also one of the strongest. Jinrei thought for a while before nodding. If you fought against him without Shirkai or Bankai, your chances of winning would be meager. Byakuya clenched his fist and did not oppose the opinion of his grandfather. In this world, there were only two people he could call his teachers. The first one was the now fugitive, Yoruchi Shohoin, who taught him everything he knew about Shuinpa. The second one was his grandfather, to whom he owed all his skills. "It seems like I need more training." Byakuya was a man who could be called pride itself. But his pride did not rest on what he obtained by birth, but what he gained thanks to his arduous and continuous training. It was one thing to be still weaker than some captains, but weaker than a student? So what if he could beat him by using his Shirkai or Bankai? Needing to use his weapons against a student was a humiliation all by itself. His pride refused to accept it, and the simplest answer was to train and reach even greater heights. Looking at the determined back of his grandson, Jinrei let out a smile. Byakuya's mood had been at an all-time low since the death of his Anna. Finding someone that could spur him on was a good thing. Meanwhile, unaware that he became some sort of rival for the man named Byakuya, Gojo shook his head when he heard how Renji replied to Rukia's words. It seems like the man had decided to adopt Rukia in the Kachiki family. What's more, once she was adopted, she would immediately graduate and be sent to the 13th Division. Even though Gojo didn't really like this clear show of nepotism, this was clearly a good thing for Rukia. But Gojo couldn't understand why. It wasn't rare for nobles to adopt people of the Rukongai when they showed talent. Even in his case, he had received many such demands, even though he always ignored them. But, although Rukia wasn't bad, she wasn't particularly talented either. At least not at the level where the head of the Kachiki family would come and make the proposal himself. Something felt off. When Rukia explained this, it was clear that she wished for Renji to stop her, to tell her to stay. But Renji didn't do so, and she simply walked away. Clearly, she had decided to accept the proposal for reasons purely emotional. Well, not like it's my problem. Even though he quite likes Rukia, They weren't close enough for him to drown in worries because of her. She was free to make her own choices. If in the end she regretted her choice, then she would have no one to blame other than herself, and in the same way, if she succeeded, then she would have no one to praise other than herself. This was how life worked. After the short episode with Rukia, 3 days went past. Rinji clearly became a little more withdrawn, but at the same time, far more motivated. It seemed that no matter the world, love could make men work far more harder. Meanwhile, after GOJO made a full report about the situation and also mentioned the 2 silhouettes, the professors judged that it should be 2 powerful Minos. Of course, GOJO wasn't stupid enough to mention his suspicions about those 2 being Shinigami. As one of the higher-ups in the jujitsu world, GOJO knew that people standing at the top had the bad habit of immediately executing anyone who could disturb their orders. As he was now, GOJO wasn't powerful enough, and he didn't wish to poke the hornet's nest and enter some deep whirlpools of plots and machinations. For all he knew, the culprits could be captains or some nobles at the same level. Toshiro had already left the healing quarters and was told to recuperate at school for about a week. What's more, since it was known that he had already reached the level of Shirkai, some divisions had already begun to send him invitations. Right now, all he needed was to reach practitioner rank in Kido, and he could graduate. With his learning speed, GOJO knew that it wouldn't take long for Toshiro to do so. As of now, though, the one about to graduate was none other than GOJO. He had already learned everything he wished to learn from the academy, and staying longer was just a waste of time. He could feel the smell of conspiracy in the air. As such, while he was already comparable to a vice captain, it simply wasn't enough. The problem, though, was that he was hesitant about which division he should join. He was mainly hesitating between the 2nd Division, who had the secret force, the 4th Division with the healing squad, and finally the 12th Division with the research center. Initially, the 12th Division wasn't one of his goals, and he had pretty much decided for the 4th Division. But after understanding that the secret of getting back limitless could be in studying the Dong-ai, he began to waver. After all, the reason he wanted to learn healing Kido was to obtain the ability to keep limitless constantly activated. Well, it's decided. The graduation exam wasn't just a practical one, but also a theoretical one. The written exam was about things like general knowledge, history, law, and so on. It was a pretty complex exam usually, and with GOJO not really being the favorite student, the difficulty increased. Still, at the end of the day, it didn't change anything for him. He was already prepared and could have taken this test with his eyes closed. Once this was done, it was the turn of the Zankinsoki. One simply needed to reach the threshold and pass. The only difference was that the test would change depending on which division you wished to join. There, GOJO made his choice and announced the 4th Division. If he had to be honest, the 12th Division really appealed to him, but he knew that there was no way he would be assigned the right for his own research as a newbie. What's more, he didn't wish for people to learn about his research. After all, research on space-time technique was banned in the Soul Society, and the punishment was death. Because of this, the 12th Division was under heavy scrutiny by all the higher-ups. Once the choice of the division was made, they explained that now that his grades in Zanjutsu, Hoho and Hakuto would be less important, while the one in Kido, more precisely Bakudo, would be more important. What's more, he would have to take a second written test about biology and anatomy. If the written exams had been a walk in the park, then the practical one was just a piece of cake. Even though he didn't awaken his Shirkai, he easily beat the examiner thanks to his speed and skills. The same happened with the Hakuto examiner, and this time, he didn't even have to use Black Flash. During the Ho-Ho test, which consisted of an obstacle course, he broke a new record. For the Kido test, he blew the mind of the examiners away when he used a bunch of Kido in the number 50 without any problems. Finally, he only used 30 minutes out of the 3 hours allocated for biology and anatomy. Even without waiting for the results, GOJO already knew that he had succeeded. Smiling, he waved his hand at the instructors as he left the scene. And as he thought, after the examiner reviewed his results, they were dismayed to find that there was nothing they could do. On that day, GOJO beat all the records established in the school as he graduated with perfect marks just 1 month after entering the academy. Everyone, be it the students, the teachers, or even the official Shinigami who heard the news, couldn't help but wonder how such a monster came to be. On that day, GOJO finally got rid of his status as a student. Siriidii, 4th Division. Under the moonlight, a beautiful black-haired woman wearing a black kimono and a white cloak with the number 4 on the back sat quietly as she sipped on her green tea while gazing at the reflection of the moon on the artificial lake. Next to her, a tall silver-haired woman also stood silently. In fact, calling her tall would be an understatement, since she reached an impressive height of 187 centimeters, a height only a few men could reach. Still, this changed nothing about her beauty. Compared to her, the black-haired woman's petite frame and kind smile gave her a motherly aura. It was a picturesque scene. Anyone seeing this would think of a knight protecting a beautiful and helpless woman. They couldn't be any more wrong. Isen Kotetsu, the vice-captain of the 4th Division, thought silently. "Something is bothering you?" Shaking her head, Isen answered, "Captain, I received the news that a student named Satoru Gojo applied to the 4th Division." Retsu Unohana tilted her head. Satoru Gojo. Wasn't he just a first year? So he already graduated. Indeed. Oh, a genius, is it? Contrary to what one might think, neither Unohana nor Isen particularly cared about the title of genius. Isen had already lived for more than 1,700 years, while Unohana was already past 2,000. In all those years, the number of geniuses they had seen was so high it was staggering. Still, why would such a genius wish to join our division? Isen also had the same doubt. Even though Captain Unohana was basically in the top 5 most powerful captains, few people knew about this. The 4th Division was without a doubt the weakest one, and generally, only Shinigami with absolutely no talent for fighting would join it. Unohana thought for a while before shaking her head. "Oh well, it doesn't matter. Once he enters, Isen, you will take care of him and teach him Kaido. After all, since such a genius chose us, no matter what his motive, we must treat him well." She could feel that this man must be joining this division for a specific goal. But she didn't care. She had once been one of the worst criminals in the Soul Society, and she was also one of the founding members of the GOJO 13. If some young pup wanted to mess around in her backyard, she would simply smack him around a few times to get him in line. I wonder if he could get my blood pumped. Isen, who more or less knew what was going through her captain's mind, gave a bitter smile as she nodded. Understood. Siriidii, 2nd Division. Meanwhile, in the barracks of the 2nd Division, Soi Fan, draped in her white cloak, frowned after she heard the report of her vice-captain. He chose the 4th Division. This was a choice that completely baffled her. It was well known that the 4th Division was basically full of cowards or people who wished to save everyone. Even though there wasn't that much difference in power between most divisions, the 4th Division was without a doubt the weakest one. Of course, Soi Fan also greatly respected the 4th Division. She knew more than anyone else the importance of having competent healers when you went on the battlefield. But this didn't change the fact that they were weak. The Gojo Satoru she remembered was not weak, and from the previous report about the Hollow incident, he should be far stronger than she remembered. What is more, he clearly wasn't a coward either. Something is fishy. Soi Fan's eyes narrowed. She hesitated for a short while before deciding against sending people to spy on him. He had already proven that this would be impossible. At the same time, she couldn't dispatch the secret force just to monitor a man because of her own intuition. "I guess I have no choice. I will have to approach him myself." Her training had been very complete back when she was just a member of the secret force like any other. Becoming close to a man to obtain information was nothing weird. If he was clean, then everything would be all right. But if he wasn't, she would simply let him get a taste of her Suzumabachi. ***. So you finally found a man that interests you. A small laugh sounded in her ears, causing Soi Fan to frown in distaste. "Omida, you are dismissed." Understood. Once Omida left, Soi Fan sighed and raised her head. There above her was floating a fairy-sized girl clothed in black and gold, while her entire right arm was covered by a yellow and black stinger. Suzumabachi. Stop bothering me. This was the spirit of Soi Fan Zanpakuto. Suzumabachi. At the captain level, or more precisely in order to reach the Bankai, the wielder had to be able to manifest the spirit of their Zanpakuto in the real world and then subjugate it. Of course, even though the spirit could manifest, in order for it to affect the real world or stay longer than a few minutes, some special means had to be used. Suzumabachi pouted a little as she continued to fly around. I already told you that you would be far happier if you stopped worshipping your Yoruchi and found a real man. That guy wasn't bad. Soifon pinched her eyebrows in annoyance. Since Zanpakuto were essentially weapons, most Shinigami thought of them as weapons. But they couldn't be more wrong. A Zanpakuto was a companion, something between a child and sibling. They had their own thoughts, opinions, and desires, and sometimes said desire didn't align with that of their wielders. Firstly, that guy doesn't interest me. I need more than a pretty face. Secondly, I do not worship Yoru-sama. Hee. You should hear yourself. If so, why do you still add Sama to her name? Forget it, I am going to sleep. After those words, Suzumabachi vanished, leaving Soifon deep in thought. A few days after officially graduating, Gojo left the academy with Momo in tears and Toshiro determined to graduate as soon as possible. Rukia had already left the academy and joined the Kachiki family, as well as the 13th Division. Currently, he was standing in front of the door of the academy as he waited for someone to come pick him up. The Siri-ITI was like a giant maze, and each division zone was as large as a little city. Because of this, new recruits had to wait for members of the division. They chose to come to pick them up in order to avoid getting lost. This time, Gojo wasn't wearing his white and blue school uniform, but a fully black kimono with wide pants as well as his usual blindfold covering his eyes. The sun was already shining high in the sky, and the temperature was steadily rising. But thankfully, he didn't have to wait long. Sorry. Looking in the direction of the voice, he saw a tall woman running toward him with her cheek flushed, though clearly more from embarrassment rather than fatigue. Once she finally reached him, she said, cheek still flushed, I am so sorry. I was supposed to come sooner, but I had an emergency. She flushed even more at this bold-faced lie. After all, she had just overslept. But how could she keep her pride as a senior if she gave such a lame explanation? Gojo lowered his blindfold and looked at the woman in front of him. A woman nearly as tall as him, short silver hair, a well-toned body with beautiful curves neither too small nor too big. She nailed the tomboy look perfectly. Yeah, I like her. Hello, my name is Satoru Gojo. Though you should already know this. Aisane immediately became more flustered. Oh, where are my manners? Ahem. Putting on a more serious expression, she continued. I am Aisane Kotetsu, Vice Captain of the 4th Division. Satoru Gojo, welcome to our division. I hope we will have a happy collaboration. I wish the same. Once they arrived at the district belonging to the 4th Division, Aisane immediately began to introduce him to the different locations. The barracks of the 4th Division were divided into 2 main buildings, one used for official meetings and such, while the other one was the hospital where the wounded were sent. Watching the young, women wearing pink kimonos akin to nurse uniforms, Gojo nodded imperceptibly. He wasn't happy because he would be surrounded by sexy nurses. Oh, who was he kidding? Of course, he was happy about being surrounded by beautiful, sexy nurses. But it wasn't just that. Now he could finally observe people using Kaido, but he wasn't in a hurry to copy them. Healing techniques were no joke. Gojo didn't want to play around with his life if it wasn't necessary. Once they were done looking around, Aisane finally stopped and turned towards him. Normally, with your grades, you should have already been given a seated position. In the GOJO 13, every division had 20 seats, the captain being the first seat, and so on. Aside from the first and second seats that could only be occupied by one person, the other seats could be occupied by multiple people. Of course, even though it was possible because of unspoken rules, only the seats from 10th and onward were occupied by more than one person. Of course, even then, it was rare for seated officers to number more than 30. If you took into account that each division had a little over 200 members, it was proof of how elite they were. The problem for the 4th Division, though, was that, while they respected martial prowess, at the end of the day, their job was healing rather than fighting. As such, to get a higher seat in this division, what was important were your healing skills. Even though this was the rule, Aisane couldn't help but be a little embarrassed. After all, even though she did not care about the genius title, it went without saying that if Gojo had chosen any other division, being offered a seat in the top 10 would have been a piece of cake. In fact, there was already a betting pool about how long he would last before asking to be transferred to another division. Gojo, of course, understood all of that. Different places, different rules. This was easy to understand. He just had to become the best, and nothing else would matter. There is no worry. Placing her hand on her chest, Isane let out a sigh of relief. Well then, I guess you must be tired. We need to visit the captain first, and then I will direct you to your personal quarters. And that will be it. Oh, I am finally going to meet that woman. Retsu Unohana. She was another reason he was so interested in this division. After all, from what Nanao said, the captain of the 4th Division was one of the few people to have reached the master rank in Kido, alongside the captain commandant. Nodding at Isane, he began to follow her and entered the hallway leading toward the office of the captain. At first, everything was all right, but the more he walked in, the heavier he felt. Gojo had experienced many kinds of Ryatsu over the past months, and when he felt the power of that one behind the door, all he could say was badass. It wasn't just a question of power, but also control. He could see it clearly. The energy wasn't affecting Isane, as if it was consciously avoiding her. Gojo was sure about something. If he fought that woman as he was now, he would die. When they finally reached the door, knock knock knock, good morning captain. It's Isane Kotetsu and the new recruit. May I enter? Enter. Opening the door, Isane gave place to Gojo, who, once he entered, was astonished by the stunningly beautiful woman sitting in front of him. But more than anything, as he observed the amount of energy stored in her body, Gojo could only murmur, "What a frightening woman." It was simply insane. His frame of reference was broad enough to make some basic comparisons, and he understood one thing: comparing his woman to normal Shinigami was an insult. Gojo had to accept that he felt goosebumps, like a lot of snakes were crawling on his skin. His heart was beating fiercely as adrenaline surged in his mind. This was it. This was what he had really been searching for. Gojo had a hunch. That woman will be essential to him one day. Oh, Gojo wasn't the only one surprised. This morning, just before she received them, she sat in thought while being bored as always. Since the day she resigned as the first Kenpachi, joined the 4th Division, and changed her name from Yuichiro to Retsu, she had reigned in most of her murderous impulse. Even during the near extermination of the Quincy remaining on Earth, she hadn't acted. After all, compared to the Quincy of nearly 1,000 years ago, who were led by Yawatch, the current Quincy were simply too weak to make her blood boil. The last man who had truly excited her was the young Zaraki. Just thinking about him made the scar he left on her chest throb. Sadly, that boy was now nothing more than a husk of what he once was. Currently, he was so weak that she could kill him hundreds of times with her eyes closed. She craved a fight, she craved death. Unfortunately, she could do nothing but stifle this burning craving deep within her. That's why she had learned healing techniques from her teacher, Tenjiro Korinji, who was a member of Division 0, as well as the greatest healer in the Soul Society. Everyone simply died too fast, so she decided to learn how to heal them as well as herself, and make the fight last as long as possible. So she couldn't help but wonder, what if she trained someone so that this person would become strong enough to fight her? Fighting to the death against her own student should satiate her craving, right? This was a thought she always nursed deep in her heart. Initially, her target was Zaraki. If she went all out, he would without a doubt break all the stupid limitations he put on himself and go back to his true level. Unfortunately, those old bastards of the Central 46 refused to let her do so. The same happened when Yamamoto tried to teach kendo to the kid. Well, technically she was older than the member of the Central 46, so she shouldn't call them old. But she was a maiden at heart, so it didn't matter. Now, since training Zaraki was impossible, she had searched high and low for someone else, but few could satisfy her standards, and those who could didn't join her division. She had already long given up hope and was ready to live a life of boredom. At least this was supposed to be the plan, but a genius joined her division. She didn't care about the title of genius. She had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of geniuses. None of them had bathed in the blood of their enemies, and most of them would freeze in fear and die on their first battlefield. Still, she was bored, and bored people do stupid things. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, she released a part of her killing intent through her Ryatsu. Of course, it was very targeted. If she used it indiscriminately, the weaker ones would directly kneel in fear or outright faint. It was just a little test. Even if he failed, nothing would change. She would still welcome him with her motherly smile as she had done for a few centuries. But he didn't even stop. The moment the boy entered, she could see it. This man wasn't afraid. Even though he showed preparation to take flight, this wasn't out of fear, but a simple understanding of his abilities. This wasn't the stance a trainee should have. Even if he killed some hollows, it shouldn't be enough to give him such poise. This man should have been some sort of warrior or soldier when he was alive. For the first time in a long while, Unohana felt her heartbeat violently in her chest. He might be the one. Nothing was certain, but if she succeeded, she would finally have a fight worth it. Welcome, Satoru Gojo. I am Retsu Unohana, your captain. I hope you will have a good time here. Looking at the smile that was completely opposite to the power she emanated, Gojo could only shake his head. Seems like I am facing a two-faced witch. Still, he wasn't new to masks and was quite adept at wearing them. Raising his eye mask, he beamed his most shining smile. Happy to meet you, Captain Unohana. Satoru Gojo at your service. Aisane tilted her head as she looked at those two smiling. Why do I feel so cold even though it's so warm? Ignoring the confused Aisane, Gojo asked. So, I was wondering what my duties would be? Unohana nodded. Our division isn't a fighting one. Still, fighting is something necessary and unavoidable. So I will give you a choice. She raised her hand and showed 2 fingers. 2 months. I will give you 2 months. During those 2 months, you will only be considered as a trial member. If after those 2 months you wish to quit, then you will be allowed to join another division without any problems. What if I wish to continue? If you wish to continue after those 2 months, then I will take you under my wing. Gojo gave a daring smile. Aren't you afraid that I will surpass you? Because I assure you that I will. Fufufu, I would love nothing more than to be surpassed. I hope your words aren't empty boasting. This was how the first meeting between Unohana and Gojo went. What did I miss? Meanwhile, Aisane was as confused as ever. Gojo had to admit, working in the 4th division was a pain of epic proportions. It has been a month now since his bet with Unohana, but he was already sick and tired and dealing with all the bullshit. It wasn't even about healing. Even though he still wasn't able to auto-heal like in the past, healing other people wasn't a problem. He was sure that with some time, he would decipher the secret to using keto on himself. What's more, he had once explained his goal about healing to Unohana, and she had assured him that she could teach him this skill if necessary. Thinking about Unohana, he couldn't help but shake his head. Every time he saw her, she would show her motherly smile and act as the strict but kind mother of the 4th division. But he knew that this wasn't all there was to her. There was simply no way a normal doctor could show such a killing intent. Even now, he has goosebumps when thinking about it. To reach this level, simply killing a large number of people wasn't enough. Rather, it was a killing intent born from finding happiness in blood and death, and coming out alive out of many bloody conflicts. This level of killing intent was something not even Sukuna could hope to reach. And that was despite him being a murderous demon renowned as the King of Curses. What baffled him, though, was that even though she had such a heavy killing intent, her kindness was no mere facade. What a bipolar woman. Casting the thought about Unohana aside, Gojo focused on healing the man laying down on the bed with a missing chunk of his stomach. It was a rather heavy wound, but since he has been brought back quite fast, saving him wasn't impossible. The reason he found this job boring was because of how he had to deal with morons. So you're saying that the hollow you guys fought had the ability to spread poison? What kind of poison was it? You bastard. How many times did I have to answer this? Can't you see he is suffering? Heal him, for hell's sake. Next to him, another Shinigami began to swear when he saw how nonchalantly Gojo was acting. Gojo had to hold the urge to sigh. This kind of guy was the kind of moron he hated dealing with. Here he was, asking nicely to have more precision about the situation, and this was how he was rewarded. Raising an eyebrow, Gojo continued in the same tone. And you think that cursing at me will somehow make me work faster? Man, you are pretty dumb, you know? You. Yes, me. So, stretching his hand, he caught the man by the collar and looked at him with eyes full of boredom. Now listen here, you dipshit. I am tired. My back is hurting like hell, and I wish for nothing more than to sleep in my large and soft bed, preferably with some beauties. Reaching there, he sent a wink toward one of the nurses standing on the side, then continued, Sadly, rather than that, I am stuck here dealing with a stupid bastard like you. So help me please, otherwise you will be the next one who needs healing. I hope I am making myself clear enough. Reaching there, he gave a sweet smile on his face. After all, a doctor always had to smile. The Shinigami, who was futilely struggling at first, immediately stopped and paled when he saw this smile. He could feel as if he was slowly being crushed under the gaze of the rude man in front of him. Gulping, he nodded and began to explain everything he saw. Once Gojo had a sufficient understanding, he nodded and relaxing his hand. Cough, cough, the man gulped air greedily while looking at Gojo with terror. But Gojo simply continued to smile. There. See, it wasn't difficult, right? Everything would have been so much better if you were so forthright from the beginning. Well, now shoo, go away, please. I will have to ask for other details later. Dismissing him with a wave of his hand, Gojo ignored the red-faced Shinigami and focused back on the one who needed healing. A nurse who stood on the side helped the Shinigami stand up and took him away. Her expression showed no shock at the scene that happened. After all, they were already used to it by now. Ignoring all this, Gojo was deep in thought. After taking a few minutes to assure himself that the wounded soldier wouldn't have an adverse reaction because of the poison and asking the nurse to inject an antidote, Gojo began to focus on the wound itself. Kaido was in itself rather complex, but also incredibly straightforward. It had neither incantations, nor names, nor numbers like the other type of Kido. Still, to heal someone, the healer had to have extreme control over their Ryatsu. Then, by using his Ryatsu and the Ryatsu of the one being healed, the healing process itself became way easier. In a way, you could say that the stronger the healer, the stronger the one being healed, the better the healing would be. Placing his hands above the wound of the man, a green light began to cover his hands. The Shinigami being healed was nothing more than a barely above-average Shinigami. But if there was one thing he didn't lack, it was Ryatsu. Thankfully, I am strong enough for the two of us. After all, thanks to the Rikugen, he had a limitless amount. Well. Guy whose name I do not know, you should be happy to have me as a doctor. Now, let's get over this. With a smirk full of confidence, he began the healing process outside of the room. Using a one-sided glass wall, 3 people were observing the scene. Every time I see this, I can only exclaim in awe. Standing outside the emergency room, Aisane couldn't help but murmur while looking at Gojo working. Even now, she could see the bleeding slowly stop and the wounds show signs of healing. At this rate, 1 or 2 hours would be enough to assure full healing. Compared to that, an average healer would have taken 2 or 3 days with many little sessions in between. Of course, it wasn't impossible to heal someone in 1 day if a healer focused on the task and used all his energy for it. But doing something like this would be irresponsible. After all, they were always understaffed and couldn't allow one of them to use all their Ryatsu just to heal one person in one go. It would be too detrimental. Indeed, it seems like his title as a genius was an understatement of his skills. Unohana, who stood beside Aisane, nodded with a smile. She could see way more, and this is why she was even more astonished, even though she didn't show it. Even though Gojo had an incredibly large amount of Ryuryoku, one that could rival any vice captain or even a captain, this wasn't anything impressive in her eyes. No, what truly made her heart pound was the godlike control he had over his energy. She always thought that no one aside from her teacher could beat her at this, but it seemed like she was wrong. Even though the man he was currently healing was the 4th one of the day, his energy showed no sign of lowering. He only seemed to be tired mentally and physically. It should be those eyes of his. Those jewel-like eyes were so beautiful that even she had been mesmerized by the first time she gazed into them. But more than their beauty, she could feel a weird power from it. It was as if, under his gaze, nothing could escape him. It seems that I really have picked a pearl. He is without a doubt extremely talented. But, Captain, we should really do something about his temper. We already received many complaints. Next to her, a tall man with spiked blonde hair complained as he adjusted his glasses. He was Yasachika Emura, the 3rd seed of the 4th Division and the leader of the 1st Relief Team. Since the 4th Division was also the healing department, it had obviously 2 different command systems. In the healing department, members were divided into 14 teams called Advanced Relief Teams. Unohana honestly hated this kind of formality since it only meant more paperwork, but she understood that it was necessary. Fufufu. So what if they complain? If they don't like it, then they should just stop coming, no? She gave a small polite laugh while uttering vicious words. And she was right. No matter how much people looked down on the 4th Division, no matter how much they treated the members as weak, cowardly people, there were some lines they would never cross. After all, offending the sole and only healing group in their ward was completely stupid. Thinking so, she asked, The man that was thrown out and the one being healed are from the 11th division, right? Isane answered with a confused look. Indeed. Ha! Then things are about to get interesting.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.